You have the badge in your pocket. I saw you put it there." The words hung in the humid Louisiana air like a death sentence. But Officer Blake Thornton just smiled, that cruel platinum blonde-framed smirk of a man who thought he'd already won, and he leaned into the back of his cruiser where Serena Voss sat handcuffed, her wrists already going numb from the metal biting into her skin, and whispered just loud enough for her to hear, but not loud enough for the body cam he'd deliberately angled away to pick up. "I don't know what you're talking about, lady. Stop making things up." The flashing blue lights in the rearview mirror didn't scare her when they first appeared on Highway 9, cutting through the thick blanket of afternoon heat that made the asphalt shimmer like water in the distance. They annoyed her, frustrated her in that deep, bone-tired way that comes from knowing you're about to waste precious time dealing with something stupid and unnecessary when you have actual important work to do. But for Officer Blake Thornton, those lights represented something entirely different. Something he'd been chasing since the day he realized his high school football glory was never coming back. They were a scepter of absolute power, a crown he could wear while the world bowed before him. And when he saw that battered rust-bucket Honda Civic with its out-of-state plates and its single female driver who looked like she was one missed paycheck away from sleeping in her car, he saw exactly what he always saw in moments like these: a victim. A plaything. Someone he could break just for the sport of watching them crumble. What Blake Thornton didn't see, what his arrogance and his carefully cultivated ignorance wouldn't allow him to see, was the Glock 19 tucked securely in Serena's waistband beneath her faded gray hoodie, or the federal badge locked in the glove compartment inside a leather case embossed with the seal of the Department of Justice, or the sealed indictment warrant sitting on the passenger seat with Chief Graham Wheeler's name typed in bold letters across the top, or the fact that this woman he was about to humiliate on the side of a lonely highway was a senior special agent with the FBI's Public Corruption Task Force, who had spent 8 months of her life building a case that would dismantle his entire department brick by corrupt brick. What started as a routine power trip, the kind Blake had pulled 100 times before on people he thought were too weak or too scared or too poor to fight back, would spiral within hours into a national scandal that would prove once and for all that sometimes, just sometimes, the person you decide to step on is the very person standing on the trapdoor to your own personal hell. And when they pull that lever, you don't get to argue your way out of the fall. This is the story of how a corrupt badge met the wrong woman on the wrong day, and how justice, when it finally comes, doesn't ask permission. It simply arrives with the force of a freight train and the precision of a surgeon's blade. The alarm on Serena's phone chirped softly at 5 in the morning. Though she was already awake, had been awake for the past hour, actually lying in the darkness of her small New Orleans apartment and running through the day's operation one more time in her head, checking and rechecking every variable, every potential point of failure. Because when you're about to take down an entire police department, there's no such thing as being too careful. The coffee maker gurgled to life as she padded into the kitchen, and she spread her case files across the table like pieces of a puzzle she'd been assembling for 8 long months. Surveillance photos of Chief Graham Wheeler shaking hands with known drug dealers. Financial records showing unexplained deposits into offshore accounts. Testimony from victims who'd been beaten and robbed by officers wearing badges, all of it building toward this moment, toward the raid that was supposed to happen in exactly 72 hours if everything went according to plan. But before Serena could lose herself in the files, before she could disappear into the work, the way she always did when a case consumed her, a small voice cut through her concentration like a knife through butter, and she looked up to see her 9-year-old daughter, Kiana, standing in the doorway, wearing her favorite purple pajamas with the stars on them. Her hair, still messy from sleep, rubbing her eyes with the back of one small fist. "Mommy, you're up early again," Kiana said, and it wasn't a question so much as an observation, the kind of thing a child says when they've gotten used to a parent who keeps irregular hours and carries the weight of the world on shoulders that sometimes seem too tired to bear it. Serena closed the files, immediately pushed them aside, and opened her arms, and Kiana crossed the kitchen and climbed into her lap the way she'd been doing since she was tiny, fitting perfectly into that space between Serena's chin and her chest that seemed designed specifically for moments like these. "I have to go away for a little while today, baby," Serena said softly, smoothing Kiana's hair back from her forehead with gentle fingers, trying to memorize the feel of this moment, because you never knew in this line of work which goodbye might be the last one, even if you didn't want to think about it that way. "Just for the day, and then I'll be back tonight for dinner, okay? Are you going to catch bad guys?" Kiana asked, and there was something in her voice that broke Serena's heart a little bit. This resigned understanding that her mother's job meant danger, meant putting herself between good people and the ones who hurt them. And sometimes that meant coming home with bruises or not coming home until late or missing school plays and birthday parties because duty called and duty didn't care about your schedule. I'm going to remind some people that the badge they wear is supposed to protect everyone, not just the people who look like them or talk like them or have money in their pockets, Serena explained, choosing her words carefully because Kiana was smart, too smart sometimes, and she deserved honesty, even if that honesty had to be wrapped in language soft enough for a 9-year-old to process. Sometimes people forget that, baby. They forget that power is supposed to be a shield we use to protect others, not a sword we use to hurt them, and when that happens, someone has to step in and remind them, has to make sure they remember why we gave them that power in the first place. Kiana was quiet for a long moment, her small fingers playing with the zipper on Serena's hoodie, and then she looked up with those big brown eyes that saw everything understood more than any child should have to understand, and asked the question that had been haunting Serena for weeks. "Mommy, are you scared when you do this? When you go after the bad guys?" And Serena could have lied, could have put on the brave face and told her daughter that FBI agents don't get scared, that fear is for other people. But instead she pulled Kiana closer and whispered the truth against the top of her head. "Every single time, baby. Every single time I'm scared, because being scared means I still care. Means I still understand that what I'm doing matters and that there are consequences if I fail. But you know what? Being scared and doing it anyway, that's what makes someone brave. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it." Kiana hugged her tighter, and Serena closed her eyes, breathing in the smell of her daughter's shampoo, and thought about all the reasons she did this job. All the children who deserved to grow up in a world where the police protected them, instead of preying on them. All the mothers who should be able to trust that when they called for help, help would actually come instead of more violence, more corruption, more of the same poison that had infected too many departments in too many small towns where nobody was watching and nobody seemed to care. The photo of Kiana that lived on Serena's refrigerator, held up by a magnet shaped like a star, smiled at her from across the kitchen, and Serena whispered to the empty room as her daughter drifted back towards sleep in her arms. "For every kid who deserves to trust the badge. That's why I do this. That's why it's worth the risk." What Serena didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have predicted as she held her daughter and prepared for what was supposed to be just another day of undercover surveillance, was that in exactly 7 hours her conviction would be tested in ways she'd never imagined. And the very people she'd spent months investigating would make the catastrophic mistake of trying to destroy her, not realizing that attacking a federal agent wasn't just a crime, it was the kind of declaration of war that brought the full weight of the United States government down on your head like the wrath of an angry god. Blake Thornton stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror at Ironclad Gym at 6 in the morning, watching his own reflection as he curled a 45-pound dumbbell. His platinum blonde buzz cut freshly trimmed, the night before every muscle in his arms and chest straining against the fabric of his tank top in exactly the way he wanted them to, because Blake understood something fundamental about power that most people never figured out. It wasn't just about what you could do, it was about what people thought you could do, and when you walked into a room looking like you could break someone in half without breaking a sweat. Half the battle was already won before you even opened your mouth. He took a selfie between sets, flexed just right so the veins in his biceps popped the way his 2,000 Instagram followers posted it with a caption about grinding and alpha mentality, and checked his phone to see a text from Sergeant Dalton asking if he wanted to split the take from last week's asset forfeiture. Stopped the one where they'd pulled over that kid with a nice watch and found an excuse to seize his car, his cash, and everything else that wasn't nailed down. Blake thumbs up emoji back and then opened his banking app, scrolling through the deposits that had been adding up nicely over the past 6 months. Little injections of cash that came from stops. Just like that one from people who couldn't afford lawyers or didn't speak English well enough to fight back, or were too scared of the system to file complaints that would just disappear into Chief Wheeler's shredder anyway. And Blake felt that familiar warm glow of satisfaction spreading through his chest. Because this was the life he deserved. This was the reward for being smart enough and strong enough and ruthless enough to take what weak people were too stupid to protect. His girlfriend had been texting him about wanting a new truck, one of those big lifted F-250S with all the bells and whistles, and Blake had already done the math in his head, 2 more months of good stops, maybe 3, if things were slow, and he could walk into that dealership with cash and drive out like a king, and nobody could say a damn word about where the money came from, because who was going to question a decorated police officer's finances? The thing about Blake Thornton that you had to understand. The thing that explained everything he did and everything he was about to do was that he'd peaked in high school, and he knew it. Even if he'd never admitted out loud or even to himself in the quiet moments before sleep when the truth sometimes managed to slip through his carefully constructed walls of denial and self-deception. He'd been the star quarterback at Pine Ridge High. The guy everyone knew and everyone wanted to be, or be with the one who got the standing ovations and the scholarship offers and the kind of attention that made you feel invincible. Like the rules that applied to regular people simply didn't apply to you because you were special, chosen, destined for greatness. But then college football had chewed him up and spit him out after 2 seasons. His knees couldn't take the punishment and his grades couldn't take the workload. And suddenly he was back in Pine Ridge with nothing but memories and a burning resentment toward a world that had promised him everything and delivered nothing except the slow realization that he was just another washed-up jock with no prospects and no future. The badge, when he'd finally gotten it after barely passing the police academy exams, had felt like salvation, like a second chance at that feeling of power and importance and being someone who mattered, and Blake had grabbed onto it with both hands and never let go, never questioned it, never stopped to wonder if maybe the people who'd given him this authority had made a terrible mistake. His philosophy was simple, brutally simple in the way that stupid philosophies often are weak people. Deserved whatever happened to them because they were too pathetic to protect themselves, and strong people like him deserved to take whatever they wanted because strength was its own justification, its own moral framework that didn't need complicated ethics or philosophical debates or any of that nonsense they'd tried to teach him in the academy about community policing and de-escalation and treating people with dignity regardless of who they were or what they looked like. Blake finished his workout, showered, and put on his uniform with the same ritualistic care that a knight might have used when putting on armor before battle, checking that every crease was sharp, every button was polished. Every element of his appearance screamed authority and dominance and the kind of power that demanded submission. He adjusted his body camera before leaving the locker room, angling it just slightly downward so that it would capture his chest and his badge, but not his face. Not the expressions that might give away his intentions or contradict whatever story he decided to tell later. Because Blake had learned through trial and error over the past 3 years exactly how to work the system. Exactly how to make the technology serve him instead of holding him accountable. Today was going to be a good day. He could feel it in his bones, that hunter's instinct that told him there were easy targets out there just waiting to be found, and as he climbed into his cruiser and pulled out of the station parking lot, he had no idea that he was about to make the worst decision of his entire life. A decision that would cost him everything he'd ever worked for and leave him with nothing but regrets and prison walls and the endless echo of his own stupidity bouncing around in his head for the next 20 years. Serena checked her speedometer as she drove down Highway 9, the numbers glowing a steady 42 in a 45 zone, which was exactly where she wanted to be, compliant, unremarkable, the kind of driver who blended into traffic and didn't give anyone any reason to look twice or wonder what she was doing out here on this lonely stretch of road that cut through pine forests and swampland like a scar across the face of southern Louisiana. The humidity was thick enough to make the windshield fog up around the edges despite the air conditioning running full blast, and Serena could feel sweat starting to gather at the small of her back beneath her hoodie. Could taste the heavy wet air, even through the car's recycled atmosphere. But she kept her focus on the road ahead, and the mission parameters running through her head like a checklist she couldn't afford to forget. Then the lights flared in her rearview mirror, sudden and violent and impossibly close. And Serena's first reaction wasn't fear. It was annoyance, deep and frustrated and edged with the kind of exhaustion that comes from having to deal with something stupid when you've got important things to do, because she knew what this was, recognized the aggressive positioning of the black and white Dodge Charger that had surged out from behind a billboard advertising personal injury lawyers, and was now riding her bumper so close she could see the officer's mirrored sunglasses reflecting the sun like two coins pressed against his face. "Not today," Serena whispered to the empty car, her grip tightening on the steering wheel not out of fear, but out of the resigned understanding that whatever was about to happen was going to complicate her day in ways she really didn't have time for. Please God, not today. Inside the cruiser, Officer Blake Thornton killed the siren, but left the lights dancing their red and blue pattern across the hood of his car, and he ran the Civic's plates through his computer, watching the screen load with that particular kind of anticipation he always felt during the hunt. And when the results came back with just 2 words, "Record not found," he felt his pulse quicken because to Blake those words didn't mean what they actually meant. Didn't translate to, "This is probably a federal vehicle registered to a government entity that's above your security clearance," but instead meant unregistered, possibly stolen, definitely suspicious. And most importantly, it meant he had a plaything for the next few minutes, someone he could push around and humiliate and remind that he was the one with the power here, not them. "Looks like we got a ghost, Tommy," Blake muttered to the empty passenger seat beside him, talking to himself the way he often did when he was working solo, like he was the star of his own reality show, and there was an audience out there hanging on his every word, waiting to see what brilliant observation or devastating comeback he'd deliver next. He adjusted his body cam with practiced ease, angling it just slightly downward so that the lens would catch his badge and his chest but not his face. Not the expressions that might tell a story different from the one he wanted told, because Blake knew all the tricks by now, had learned them from the older officers who'd taught him that the camera was there to protect them. Not the public, and if you were smart about it, you could make that technology work for you instead of against you. He stepped out into the oppressive heat that hit him like a physical wall, the kind of Louisiana afternoon that made your uniform stick to your skin within seconds and turned your cruiser into an oven if you left it parked in the sun for more than a few minutes. And he deliberately left his hat on the passenger seat because he wanted her to see his eyes. Wanted her to know from the very first moment that he was in control here that whatever power she thought she had simply didn't exist in this space, on this road in this moment, where he was the law, and she was just another civilian who needed to learn her place. His hand came to rest on the grip of his service weapon, a heavy Sig Sauer that felt like an extension of his authority, and he approached the passenger side first instead of the driver's side, a classic tactic designed to throw people off balance to make them twist uncomfortably in their seats and crane their necks to see him, to establish from the very beginning that this interaction would happen on his terms and his terms alone. Serena watched him in the side mirror, and she saw everything, the hand on the gun that was meant to intimidate, the swagger in his walk that screamed insecurity dressed up as confidence, the way he was already performing for an invisible audience instead of actually doing his job. and she recognized the type immediately because she'd arrested a dozen men just like Blake Thornton over her career. Men who'd peaked in high school or college and spent the rest of their lives trying to recapture that feeling of being important, of being someone who mattered, using the badge as a substitute for the glory that had slipped through their fingers like water. She rolled down the window and kept her hands clearly visible at the 10 and 2 positions on the steering wheel, her training kicking in automatically, even as her mind raced through the calculations of how to de-escalate this situation before it spiraled into something that compromised the operation she'd spent months building. "Good afternoon, Officer Serena," said her voice deliberately calm and neutral, the tone of someone who knew how to navigate these situations without escalating them. Someone who understood that the appearance of cooperation could sometimes be more valuable than actual resistance. Blake didn't answer immediately, and that silence was deliberate too, calculated to create discomfort and uncertainty, and he leaned down into the open window, chewing his gum loudly enough that she could hear the wet smack of it between his teeth. And he stared at her through those mirrored Oakleys that turned his eyes into blank reflective surfaces where she could see her own face looking back at her, but couldn't read anything about his intentions or his thoughts. He took a long, exaggerated look around the interior of the car, letting his gaze linger on the fast food wrappers scattered across the passenger side floor. Part of Serena's carefully constructed cover, as someone who lived in her car and barely scraped by, and then on the duffel bag visible in the back seat, and she could practically see the wheels turning in his head as he invented a narrative about who she was and why she deserved whatever he was about to do to her. "License and registration," Blake finally said, and there was no greeting in his voice, no explanation for why he'd pulled her over, no acknowledgement that she was a human being, deserving of basic courtesy. Just a command delivered in that flat tone that cops use when they want you to know they're not asking, they're telling. "Can I ask why I was pulled over?" Officer Serena asked, keeping her tone polite and respectful, even though every instinct in her body was screaming at her to identify herself to end this before it started. But she knew from experience that sometimes the best way to catch predators was to let them show you exactly who they were without any interference to give them enough rope to hang themselves and then document every knot they tied. Blake's jaw tightened at the question, and Serena could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin, because questions were defiance to men like Blake. Questions implied that she thought she had rights, that she deserved explanations, that she was somehow equal to him, instead of beneath him, and that kind of thinking needed to be corrected immediately and decisively. "I asked for your license and registration." Blake repeated, his voice rising slightly in volume and dropping in temperature, each word clipped and hard like stones being thrown one after another. "Do not make me ask a third time." Serena moved with deliberate slowness, telegraphing her intentions the way you're supposed to during traffic stops, so that nervous officers don't have an excuse to escalate. And she said clearly and calmly, "My license is in my belt bag attached to my waist. I'm going to reach for it now with my right hand." "Okay." But before her fingers could even move toward the zipper, Blake's hand snapped to his holster, and his voice cut through the humid air like a whip crack, and the transformation from bored traffic cop to aggressive enforcer happened so fast it would have been frightening if Serena hadn't seen it 100 times before in training scenarios and real-world encounters. "Don't reach for anything," Blake barked, and his hand didn't just rest on his weapon now, it actively worked the retention strap, popping it free so that the gun could be drawn in less than a second if he decided he needed it. Which was insane because Serena hadn't made a single threatening movement, hadn't raised her voice or shown any sign of aggression. But Blake needed her to be a threat, needed to justify what he was about to do by creating danger where none existed. "Keep your hands on the wheel, right where I can see them." Serena froze her hands, returning immediately to their 10 and 2 position, and she did the math in her head with the cold precision of someone who'd been in dangerous situations before and knew how to calculate threat levels and appropriate responses, and what she calculated was this. Blake Thornton was jumpy, amped up on adrenaline or steroids or both, And a jumpy cop with an ego and a gun was quite literally the most dangerous thing you could encounter on an American street, more dangerous than gang members or drug dealers or pretty much anyone else, because at least criminals knew they'd face consequences if they shot you. Whereas cops like Blake had been taught by experience and observation that they could get away with almost anything, as long as they said the right magic words afterward. I feared for my life. I thought I saw a weapon. I gave multiple commands that were not followed. The calmness in Serena's voice, the way she hadn't flinched or begged or shown the fear that Blake was clearly trying to provoke, seemed to infuriate him even more, because her composure felt like an insult to his authority. Felt like she thought she was better than him, smarter than him. Somehow above the rules that applied to everyone else. He pulled over on this highway. "Step out of the vehicle," Blake commanded, and it wasn't a request, wasn't framed as officer safety or routine procedure, but delivered as pure dominance, the verbal equivalent of pressing his boot down on someone's neck just to remind them who had the power to crush them if he wanted to. "That's not protocol for a traffic stop, officer," Serena countered, keeping her voice even and factual rather than confrontational, because she was still hoping foolishly. Maybe that introducing logic and procedure into this encounter might remind Blake that he was supposed to be a professional enforcer of laws, rather than a playground bully with a badge. "I haven't committed any infraction that would justify ordering me out of my vehicle." Blake's response was as predictable as it was infuriating, and Serena actually closed her eyes for a split second when she heard him say it, because she knew exactly where this was going, and there was no stopping it. "Now, I smell marijuana." Blake lied, the words coming out smooth and practiced, because he'd used this excuse dozens of times before, and it had worked every single time, giving him the probable cause he needed to search and seize and do whatever he wanted. Because how could anyone prove he hadn't smelled something that left no physical evidence, that existed only in his imagination and his willingness to perjure himself? "Step out of the vehicle now, or I'll add resisting to your charges." Serena hadn't smoked marijuana a single day in her entire life, and the Honda Civic she was driving was a government-issued vehicle that had never contained any controlled substances unless you counted the Advil in her glove box. But arguing those facts with Blake would be pointless, because the smell of marijuana wasn't actually about marijuana, it was about power. About Blake's ability to manufacture justification for whatever he'd already decided he was going to do. And fighting him on it would only give him the excuse to escalate further, to drag her out by force, instead of letting her exit voluntarily. And Serena needed to stay in control of this situation, even as Blake tried his hardest to strip that control away. She unbuckled her seatbelt with movements that were slow and careful and visible, and she opened her door and stepped out onto the gravel shoulder rising to her full height of 5 feet 9 inches, and for just a moment, Blake seemed almost surprised, because Serena was athletic and fit, and held herself with the kind of rigid discipline that came from years of Quantico training and daily workouts. The kind of bearing that should have tipped him off that she wasn't what she appeared to be. But Blake was too busy cataloging her worn-out sneakers and the frayed edges of her hoodie, and the fact that she was a black woman driving a beat-up car through his territory, and those surface details were all he needed to confirm his prejudices and justify his actions. "Turn around," Blake ordered, spinning his finger in the air like he was directing traffic, his voice taking on that particular edge of satisfaction that came from knowing he was about to humiliate someone, and there was nothing they could do about it. "Hands on the hood of the car. Spread your legs wide." "Officer, before we go any further with this," Serena said, and her voice had shifted now from respectfully neutral to firmly authoritative, the voice she used in interrogation rooms and courtrooms, when she needed people to understand that she wasn't just some random civilian they could push around. "You need to know that I am a federal." But she never got to finish the sentence, because Blake's hand came down hard on her shoulder and shoved her forward with enough force that she stumbled and had to catch herself against the hot metal of the car hood, and the heat seared into her palms even through her skin. And Blake was screaming now, actually screaming like a drill sergeant, or an abusive parent, or someone who'd completely lost control of himself. "Shut your mouth." I didn't ask for your life story. I told you to spread them." The hood of the car felt like it was burning her hands. The metal superheated by hours sitting in the Louisiana sun. And Serena's training was screaming at her that she could disarm Blake in approximately 3 moves, could have his weapon secured and him on the ground before he even processed what was happening. But the discipline of the Bureau held her back, because fighting a uniformed police officer, even a corrupt one, would create exactly the kind of messy media narrative that could compromise the entire operation and turn her from victim to villain in the court of public opinion. "You're making a mistake," Serena said through gritted teeth. Her face pressed uncomfortably close to the windshield wiper, and she could feel the metal scraping against her cheek. "Check my credentials. They're in the glove compartment of my vehicle in a black leather case, and they will explain everything about who I am and why you need to stop this right now before you do something you can't take back." "I'm checking your pockets," Blake sneered, and he began a pat-down that was rougher than any legitimate officer's safety search had any right to be. His hands moving over her body in ways that were clearly meant to intimidate and humiliate rather than actually check for weapons, lingering in places that made Serena's skin crawl and her jaw clench with barely suppressed rage, because this wasn't policing. This was assault with a badge. This was someone using the authority of the state to violate another human being's dignity and bodily autonomy just because he could, just because the system had given him permission and protection and the reasonable expectation that he'd never face consequences for his actions. Blake pulled her wallet from her back pocket and flipped it open with one hand while keeping the other pressed firmly between her shoulder blades to hold her in place, and he read her driver's license with the kind of theatrical mockery that told Serena he was performing for his body camera, creating a narrative that would paint him as professional and her as difficult. Serena Voss. Blake read aloud, and he dragged out her name like it was something distasteful in his mouth. Sounds like a stripper name if I've ever heard one. "You work the clubs down in New Orleans." Serena. "That where you get the money for your drugs and your car dancing for men who throw dollars at you?" Through gritted teeth, her voice vibrating with barely controlled fury, Serena forced out the words. "I work for the United States government, and if you don't stop touching me right now and check the credentials that I told you about, you are going to regret this for the rest of your life." Blake laughed, and it was a loud barking laugh that held no humor, just cruelty and contempt and the absolute certainty of someone who believed that his authority was unquestionable and his actions were beyond consequences. And he said with mock surprise, "Oh yeah, and I'm the King of England. Sweetheart, what do you do for the government? Clean the toilets at the post office. That makes you a federal employee too, doesn't it?" He kicked her ankles apart wider, forcing her into an even more vulnerable and uncomfortable position, and he told her to stay exactly where she was while he ran her for warrants. And then he walked back to his cruiser with the swagger of a man who thought he'd already won this encounter and had no idea that he'd just made the single worst decision of his entire life. 50 feet behind Officer Blake Thornton's cruiser, sitting in the back seat of a silver minivan that smelled like French fries and cleaning products, 8-year-old Jordan Chen watched the traffic stop unfold with the kind of intense focus that children bring to moments when the adult world suddenly stops making sense, when the rules they've been taught about right and wrong and how things are supposed to work seem to dissolve in front of their eyes, leaving only confusion and questions that demand answers. Even if those answers are uncomfortable or complicated or don't fit neatly into the stories we tell ourselves about justice and fairness and the people who are supposed to protect us. Jordan's father, Anthony, was gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles, and his mother, Lisa, was twisted halfway around in the passenger seat trying to see what was happening up ahead. And they were having one of those whispered arguments that parents have when they don't want their children to hear, but the car is too small and the child is too perceptive, and the words leak through anyway like water through cracks in a dam. "We're already late to your mother's house," Anthony was saying, his voice tight with the particular stress of someone who knew his mother-in-law was timing their arrival and would absolutely comment if they showed up even 5 minutes past the appointed hour. "We can't afford to get involved in whatever this is." We don't know the situation. We don't know what she did." But Lisa wasn't listening to her husband's very reasonable concerns about punctuality and staying out of other people's business, because she was a mother first, and everything else second. And what she was watching through the windshield was making every maternal instinct in her body scream that something was wrong, that what was happening up there on the shoulder of Highway 9 wasn't right, wasn't the way things were supposed to work, even if she couldn't articulate exactly what rules were being broken or what she was supposed to do about it. Someone to care enough to make the truth matter. "Honey, don't stare," Lisa said automatically. But even as the words left her mouth, she was pulling out her phone and opening the camera app. It's not our business, but her hands were already tapping the record button because maybe it wasn't their business in the sense of being their problem to solve. But it was their business in the sense that witnessing injustice and doing nothing made you complicit in it, made you part of the system that allowed men like that officer to treat people like that woman as if they were less than human. Jordan pressed his face against the window, his breath fogging the glass, and he said with the devastating clarity that children sometimes possess, "But you said police help people, Mom. You said if I'm ever scared or lost, I should find a police officer and they'll keep me safe. But that policeman isn't helping. He's hurting her." Anthony's hands tightened even more on the steering wheel, and he closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, something had shifted in his expression. Some calculation had been made, and a decision reached, and he said, quietly to his wife, without taking his eyes off the scene ahead, "Lisa, don't get involved. Please. Think about Jordan. Think about—" But Lisa cut him off, not rudely but firmly, with a question that stopped his objections. Cold. "If that was our daughter up there, Anthony? If that was Jordan in 15 years getting treated like that, wouldn't you want someone to care enough to record it to make sure there was proof of what really happened, instead of just the officer's word against theirs?" The question hung in the air between them, unanswerable and undeniable, and Anthony's shoulders sagged slightly in defeat, because of course his wife was right. Of course she was, because that was the thing about injustice. It was always someone else's problem right up until the moment it became yours, and by then it was too late to build the kind of world where people looked out for each other instead of looking away. Jordan watched as his mother's phone captured everything, the way the officer's hands moved roughly over the woman's body, the way she stood perfectly still and didn't fight back, even though Jordan could see from her posture that she was strong enough to fight if she wanted to, the way the officer seemed to be enjoying himself in a way that made Jordan's stomach hurt, even though he couldn't quite explain why. "She's not fighting back." Jordan observed, his voice small and confused. "So why is he still being mean to her? I thought police only have to be tough with bad guys who are dangerous, but she's not doing anything dangerous." Lisa kept filming her hands, trembling slightly, but her resolve steady, and she said to her son without looking away from the phone screen, "Sometimes baby grown-up situations are complicated in ways that are hard to explain. But what I can tell you is this. What we're seeing right now isn't right, isn't the way things are supposed to be. And that's why Mommy is recording it, because sometimes the only power regular people have is the power to tell the truth about what they saw." "Can we help her?" Jordan asked, and there was something heartbreaking in the question, in the assumption that of course they would help if they could, that standing by and watching someone suffer when you had the ability to intervene was simply unthinkable. And Lisa felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes because she was raising a good kid. A kind kid, the kind of person who saw suffering and wanted to ease it instead of walking past it or pretending it didn't exist. Anthony spoke up, then his voice rough with emotion. He was trying hard to keep under control. "We are helping her, buddy. We're going to be witnesses if she needs us. We're going to tell the truth about what we saw, and sometimes that's the most important thing regular people can do." "What's witnesses?" Jordan asked, stumbling slightly over the unfamiliar word, and Lisa finally lowered her phone for a moment and turned to look at her son directly, and she said with the kind of solemnity that told Jordan this was important, this was a lesson he needed to remember. Witnesses are people who see something happen and then tell the truth about it later. Even if telling the truth is hard or scary or makes other people angry, they tell it anyway because truth matters more than being comfortable or safe or popular. Jordan nodded slowly, processing this information with the seriousness it deserved, and he said with the kind of simple conviction that adults spend their whole lives trying to recapture, "I can do that. I'm good at truth. I never lie, even when lying would be easier. Teacher says, I have integrity." Lisa smiled, despite the tears now actively streaming down her face, and she reached back to squeeze her son's hand, and she thought about how proud she was of this little person she and Anthony had made this 8-year-old boy who still believed the world could be fair if people just cared enough to make it that way. They watched together as the situation continued to escalate as the officer walked back to his cruiser and made a phone call as backup arrived in the form of another police car that pulled up behind the first one. And through it all, Lisa kept recording, kept bearing witness, kept holding on to the evidence that would later prove crucial in dismantling the comfortable lies that men like Blake Thornton told themselves about who they were and what they did and why they deserved to get away with it. Jordan's small voice cut through the tense silence in the minivan one more time. "That lady looks scared. Dad, can we help her now?" Anthony gripped the steering wheel and made a decision that would change the trajectory of this entire story. And he said with quiet determination, "We're not leaving until this is over. Jordan, we're going to stay right here and watch and remember everything we see, because that lady might need us to tell her story when this is all done, and we're going to be here for her. Okay?" Jordan nodded solemnly, and he kept his eyes fixed on the woman by the car. This stranger who was being treated so badly by someone who was supposed to protect people. And he committed every detail to memory, the way children do when they're witnessing something that violates their understanding of how the world is supposed to work, creating a record in his mind that would later emerge as testimony so clear and devastating that a jury would weep while listening to it. Blake Thornton sat in his cruiser with the air conditioning blasting and his radio crackling with routine traffic, and he keyed his microphone and said with forced casualness that didn't quite hide the edge of excitement in his voice, "Dispatch, this is Unit 4, Alpha. I've got a female suspect approximately 30 years old, driving unregistered vehicle, non-compliant and argumentative, showing signs of possible narcotics use, requesting backup for a vehicle search." The dispatcher's voice came back immediately, and Natasha had been working the Pine Ridge PD radio for 7 years, and she knew exactly what Blake meant when he said possible narcotics use, because that was the code they all used when they wanted to search someone's car without having actual probable cause. The magic words that turned fishing expeditions into legitimate police work on paper, even if everyone involved knew it was garbage. Copy that. 4 Alpha. Natasha set her tone bored and professional. Unit 4 Bravo is en route to your location. ETA 3 minutes. Blake ran Serena's name through the National Crime Information Center database while he waited for backup typing in her license number and waiting for the system to load. And when the results finally came back on his screen, he frowned. Because instead of the usual display showing prior arrests or outstanding warrants or a clean record, what he got was something he'd never seen before. No record found. Restricted access. Level 5. Clearance required. Blake stared at those words for a long moment, his brain trying to process what they meant, and coming up with answers that should have alarmed him, but instead got filtered through his assumptions and prejudices until they transformed into something that fit his pre-existing narrative about who Serena was and what she deserved. In Blake's mind, restricted access didn't mean this is a federal agent whose information is classified for operational security reasons. It meant the system was glitching. Or maybe she had a sealed juvenile record from years ago that had been expunged, but still left traces in the database. Or maybe she'd been in the system so many times under so many different names that the files had gotten corrupted and confused, and any of those explanations made more sense to Blake than the possibility that he'd just pulled over someone who outranked him by about 15 pay grades and had the authority to make his life very difficult very quickly. Blake wasn't what anyone would call a deep thinker. Wasn't the type to question his first impressions or second-guess his instincts, and his instincts were telling him that this woman in her beat-up car, with her worn-out clothes and her attitude, was hiding something. And whatever she was hiding was probably criminal, and his job was to find it and arrest her for it and add another gold star to his record of stops and seizures that made Chief Wheeler so happy during performance reviews. Sergeant Dalton's cruiser pulled up behind Blake's with its lights still flashing, and Dalton stepped out with the heavy wheezing movements of a man who'd spent too many years eating donuts at his desk and not enough years actually walking a beat, and he hitched up his belt under his considerable belly and walked up to Blake's window. "What you got?" Blake Dalton asked, and there was a note of anticipation in his voice, because Dalton loved a good stop almost as much as Blake did. Loved the feeling of power that came from making people squirm and beg, and realize that their rights and their dignity only existed at the pleasure of the officers who chose whether or not to respect them. "Uppity one," Blake replied, jerking his thumb toward where Serena still stood, with her hands on the hood of her car, her posture rigid and controlled in a way that suggested she was expending tremendous effort to keep herself from doing something she'd regret later. Claims she works for the government. Says she's some kind of federal agent or something. Probably saw it on TV and thought it would get her out of a ticket. Dalton let out a wheezing laugh that turned into a cough halfway through, and he looked over at Serena with open disdain, taking in her appearance and dismissing her in the span of about 2 seconds. And he said with the casual cruelty of someone who'd learned to dehumanize people as a survival mechanism in a job that required you to inflict suffering on strangers, her a fed. "Yeah, and my ex-wife is Mother Teresa. She looks like she's been sleeping in that car for a week. Probably hasn't had a real meal in days. Definitely looks like she's on something." Serena's voice cut through the humid air with a quality that should have stopped both officers in their tracks. A tone that dropped from respectful compliance to dangerous warning in the space of a single breath. "My badge is in the glove compartment of my vehicle in a black leather case, and if you arrest me without checking those credentials first, you won't be charging me with anything. You'll be committing the federal crime of kidnapping a law enforcement officer, and I strongly suggest you think very carefully about your next move, Sergeant." Dalton paused, and something in Serena's voice penetrated his walls of assumption and prejudice just enough to create a moment of doubt, because that wasn't the desperate pleading of a junkie trying to talk her way out of trouble. That was the command voice of a superior officer giving orders that expected to be followed, and Dalton had been a cop long enough to recognize the difference, even if he didn't want to acknowledge what it meant. He looked at Blake and said, with just a hint of uncertainty creeping into his swagger, "Did you check the car?" "Not yet," Blake admitted. "I wanted to secure the suspect first, make sure she wasn't armed or dangerous before I started searching." "Well, check it now," Dalton muttered, and there was something in his tone that suggested he was hedging his bets, protecting himself in case this situation turned out to be more complicated than Blake had initially presented, just in case she's actually got a gun or something that justifies all this drama. Blake rolled his eyes and huffed out an annoyed breath because he felt like Dalton was letting this woman get in his head, was allowing her to create doubt where there should only be certainty. But orders were orders, and Dalton outranked him technically, even if Blake thought the fat old sergeant was past his prime and probably should have retired years ago. He walked over to the Honda Civic and yanked the passenger door open with more force than necessary, and he started rummaging through the fast food bags and napkins scattered across the floor, tossing them out onto the roadside, with casual disregard for the fact that he was destroying evidence and contaminating what was technically a crime scene, if this turned out to be what Serena claimed it was. Blake opened the center console next, and his hands froze when they closed around something cold and metal, and he pulled out a spare magazine loaded with 9mm hollow point ammunition, the kind of rounds that weren't available at your average gun store, The kind that had federal government property stamped on the base of each cartridge in letters so small you'd need a magnifying glass to read them, but they were there nonetheless. Blake stared at the magazine in his hand, and for the first time since he'd initiated this stop, a tiny seed of doubt began to germinate in his mind, began to send out roots that whispered, maybe, just maybe he'd made a mistake. But he crushed that doubt immediately because admitting error now would mean consequences, would mean explaining to Chief Wheeler why he'd roughed up someone who might actually be who she claimed to be, and Blake's survival instinct told him the only way forward was to double down to commit fully to the narrative he'd started creating and see it through to whatever end awaited him. He reached for the glove compartment and his hands were actually shaking slightly now, though he told himself it was just adrenaline, just the natural physical response to the excitement of a good stop. And he popped the latch and the compartment door fell open, and sitting there on top of the owner's manual and the insurance paperwork was a black leather wallet with a gold embossment that caught the sunlight and seemed to glow with an authority all its own. The seal of the Department of Justice, an eagle with spread wings clutching arrows and an olive branch, and beneath it the words that would change Blake Thornton's life forever. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Blake picked up the wallet with hands that were definitely shaking. Now there was no denying it anymore, and the leather felt heavy in a way that had nothing to do with its actual weight, and everything to do with what it represented. And he flipped it open with the kind of dread you feel when you're opening a letter. You know contains bad news when you're checking test results. You know will be negative when you're looking at something that will confirm your worst fears and destroy your comfortable delusions. The gold badge gleamed inside the wallet, polished and perfect and unmistakably real. And next to it was a photo identification card with an official seal and a photograph that showed the exact same face as the woman currently handcuffed against her car hood 50 feet away. And beneath the photo were printed the words, Special Agent Serena M. Voss, Federal Bureau of Investigation Public Corruption Task Force. Blake's stomach dropped so fast and so hard it felt like he'd swallowed a stone, like gravity had suddenly increased tenfold, and was pulling his internal organs down through his feet and into the earth beneath him. And he stood there holding this badge, this undeniable proof that he had just committed what was probably the single stupidest act of his entire life. And his mind raced through his options and came up with exactly nothing good. Nothing that would save him from the consequences of what he'd done. He looked back at where Dalton was standing near the cruiser, and he looked at Serena, who was staring straight at him with an expression that was completely unreadable, and he looked down at the badge again, as if it might have changed or disappeared or revealed itself to be fake, but it was still there, still real, still condemning him with its mere existence. "Well," Dalton called out, his voice carrying across the distance. "What did you find?" And Blake Thornton, staring at the badge that represented everything he should have respected and protected, but had instead violated and attacked, made a decision that would determine the trajectory of the rest of his life. And instead of doing the right thing, instead of admitting his mistake and apologizing and hoping for mercy, he snapped the badge case shut and shoved it deep into his own pocket and called back to Dalton with a voice that cracked slightly before he managed to steady it. "Nothing, just trash and fast food wrappers. No ID, no badge, no nothing. She's lying through her teeth like I thought she was." Dalton squinted at Blake from across the distance separating them, and something in the younger officer's body language wasn't quite right, wasn't quite matching the confident dismissal in his voice. And Dalton had been doing this job for 23 years, and he'd learned to read the subtle tells that separated truth from lies. But he also understood the code. Understood that sometimes you backed up your fellow officers, even when you suspected they might be stepping over lines that shouldn't be crossed because the alternative was being labeled a rat, or a troublemaker, or someone who couldn't be trusted to keep his mouth shut, when the department needed solidarity more than honesty. "You sure about that?" Dalton asked, giving Blake one more chance to come clean, one more opportunity to admit that maybe they should double-check. Maybe they should call a supervisor. Maybe they should treat this situation with a bit more caution than they'd been showing. I'm sure Blake said, and the lie came easier the second time, the way lies always do once you've committed to them, and realized that turning back is harder than pushing forward. She's just a junkie with delusions of grandeur who probably found a gun magazine on the street and thought it would make her sound important. We're taking her in for the drugs I'm about to find in her car. Blake walked back toward Serena with a newfound determination born of desperation, because he understood now that he couldn't just make this problem go away by releasing her and hoping she'd forget about it. Couldn't simply apologize his way out of having assaulted and illegally detained a federal agent, because even if she was merciful enough to let the rough treatment slide there, would still be questions about why he pulled her over in the first place, why he escalated when she was complying, why he didn't check her credentials when she specifically told him where they were, and those questions would lead to reviews and investigations, and the kind of scrutiny that would reveal all the other stops Blake had made that crossed similar lines, all the other times he'd planted evidence or lied on reports or used his badge to settle personal scores against people who'd offended his ego. The only way out now, the only path Blake could see that led somewhere other than unemployment and criminal charges and the complete destruction of everything he'd built, was to go all in on the lie to manufacture evidence that would justify his actions retroactively, to transform Serena from victim to criminal before she could transform him from officer to defendant. He leaned into the back of his cruiser where Serena sat with her wrists still cuffed behind her shoulders still throbbing from where he'd wrenched it, and he got close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath and the sweat soaking through his uniform. And he whispered, just loud enough for her to hear, but not loud enough for the body camera to pick up clearly. I checked no badge in there, just a liar making up stories to get out of trouble. You should have stayed quiet, should have taken your ticket and gone on your way, but you had to push it, had to make this difficult. Serena's eyes widened as the full implications of what Blake was saying crashed over her like a wave, and she realized instantly that this wasn't just a case of a bully cop who'd gone too far and would face administrative punishment. This was something much darker and more dangerous. This was a corrupt officer who was willing to commit felonies to cover up his mistakes, who understood that the badge in his pocket represented evidence of federal crimes, but was choosing to hide it anyway, because admitting the truth was more terrifying to him than doubling down on lies. "You have the badge in your pocket," Serena said, enunciating each word clearly and carefully so there could be no misunderstanding. "I saw you put it there. I watched you take it from my glove compartment and slip it into your uniform, and that's theft of federal property in addition to everything else you've done today." Blake straightened up and said loudly enough for his body camera to catch it, loudly enough for Dalton to hear, loudly enough to create the official record he'd need later when this all went to trial. "I don't know what you're talking about, ma'am. I checked your vehicle thoroughly and found no badge, no credentials, nothing that supports your claim to be any kind of law enforcement officer. Now I suggest you stop making things up and accept that you're in custody for legitimate reasons." He slammed the door of the cruiser with enough force to rock the entire vehicle on its suspension, and he walked over to where Dalton was standing and said in a low voice that suggested conspiracy and shared guilt, "Tow the car. Get it to the impound lot and search it piece by piece, every inch of that vehicle. And if you find anything interesting, anything that might complicate our story, you make it disappear. You understand what I'm saying?" Dalton nodded slowly, and the motion was heavy with the weight of 23 years of similar nods, similar moments where he'd chosen loyalty to the badge over loyalty to the truth, where he'd decided that protecting corrupt officers was more important than protecting the public they'd sworn to serve. And he said with the tired resignation of a man who'd long ago stopped fighting against the current, and had learned instead to let it carry him wherever it wanted to go, "I understand. I'll make sure the car gets processed properly. Make sure we find what we need to find and lose what we need to lose." As Blake climbed into the driver's seat of his cruiser, Serena leaned her head back against the hard plastic seat that had been molded specifically to be uncomfortable, specifically to remind prisoners that they had no power and no comfort and no hope of anything better until the system decided to grant them mercy. And she closed her eyes and took a deep breath, that was part meditation and part prayer. And she thought with the cold clarity of someone who'd been doing this job long enough to know exactly how it worked. You just buried yourself. Officer Blake. Thornton. You took a situation that might have ended with a reprimand and an apology and transformed it into a federal case that will follow you for the rest of your life. And I'm going to be the one standing over your grave when they finally bury you under the weight of your own stupidity and arrogance. The back of Blake's Dodge Charger smelled like vomit and industrial cleaner, that particular combination of human misery and chemical sterility that seemed to permeate every police transport vehicle in America, a scent so deeply embedded in the hard plastic seats and the rubber floor mats that no amount of scrubbing could ever truly remove it, as if the car itself had absorbed the desperation and fear and rage of the hundreds of people who'd been dragged to jail in this exact seat. Their hands cuffed behind them, just like Serena's were now, their futures uncertain, and their rights contingent on the mercy of officers who'd already demonstrated they had none. Serena sat as still as she could manage, given the awkward positioning of her arms and the painful tightness of the cuffs cutting off circulation to her hands, and while most people in her situation would have been crying or begging or demanding to speak to a lawyer, Serena was doing something much more useful. She was counting, memorizing, recording every detail of this journey in her mind with the precision of someone who knew that evidence mattered and testimony mattered, and that every turn and timestamp and radio code would eventually be used to reconstruct exactly what had happened and who was responsible. Left turn onto Oak Street, she noted, mentally checking the time on Blake's dashboard clock and committing it to memory, 4:47 p.m. Right turn onto Main Avenue, speed increasing to 55 in what she was pretty sure was a 30-mile-per-hour zone based on the residential houses flashing past the window, more evidence of reckless behavior that would add to the pile of charges Blake was building against himself without even realizing it. She listened to the radio codes Blake was muttering under his breath, half to himself and half to dispatch, and she cataloged each one because radio traffic was recorded and time-stamped and would provide an independent verification of the timeline she was constructing, would prove that Blake had knowingly and deliberately transported someone he knew or should have known was a federal agent to jail instead of calling a supervisor or checking her credentials or doing literally anything that a reasonable officer would have done in the same situation. Blake kept glancing in the rearview mirror, his eyes meeting Serena's reflection with a mixture of defiance and something that might have been fear if he'd been self-aware enough to recognize it. And he said with forced bravado that didn't quite hide the tremor underneath, "You're quiet back there. Usually you people are screaming and crying by now, begging me to let you go, promising you'll do anything if I just give you one more chance." "You people," Serena repeated, her voice calm, but edged with enough sharpness to cut through Blake's pretense. "That's an interesting choice of words. Officer Thornton, care to clarify exactly which group of people you're referring to?" Blake's face flushed red, and he realized he'd said something that could be interpreted as racist. That would sound terrible on any recording or in any courtroom testimony, and he tried to backpedal with the clumsiness of someone who wasn't used to being challenged or questioned or held accountable for the words that came out of his mouth. "Criminals. I meant criminals. People who break the law and then lie about it when they get caught. People who think a fake story and some attitude will get them out of facing consequences for their actions." But the damage was done. The words were out there, floating in the air and captured on the body camera that was still running, even if Blake had positioned it poorly and Serena filed that away too. Added it to the growing mountain of evidence that would eventually bury Blake under its weight. And she almost felt sorry for him in that moment. Almost felt a twinge of pity for this stupid, arrogant man who had no idea that he was actively destroying his own life with every word he spoke and every decision he made. Blake slammed on the brakes as they pulled into the rear sally port of the Pine Ridge Police Department, and the sudden deceleration threw Serena forward against her seatbelt, and the electronic gate rattled open slowly, grinding on rusty tracks that suggested it hadn't been properly maintained in years. revealing a fortress of concrete and brick that looked like it had been built sometime in the 1970s and never updated since, a building that existed outside of time and oversight and the modern reforms that had transformed most police departments into something resembling professional organizations instead of private armies, accountable to no one. Blake hauled Serena out of the car with hands that were rougher than they needed to be, and he didn't guide her or help her maintain balance, but instead yanked her forward by the chain connecting her handcuffs, pulling her like she was a stubborn animal being dragged to slaughter, and Serena stumbled but caught herself before she could fall, her sneakers scuffing on the oil-stained concrete that bore witness to decades of similar arrivals, similar degradations, similar moments when the full weight of state power pressed down on individual human beings and reminded them exactly how powerless they really were, when the system decided it was their turn to suffer. "Walk," Blake shouted, and he shoved her toward the steel door that led into the booking area, and Serena walked because fighting him physically would accomplish nothing except giving him an excuse to add resisting arrest to whatever charges he was planning to fabricate, and she needed to stay calm, needed to maintain her composure and her dignity, even as Blake tried his hardest to strip both away from her. Inside the booking area, the fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered with a sound like angry insects, and two other officers were processing a drunk driver who could barely stand laughing as the man struggled to complete a field sobriety test that he had no hope of passing, and the dispatcher Natasha sat behind a high glass partition eating a sandwich and watching a small television that was playing a game show with the volume turned low. "Got a fresh one, Blake?" Natasha asked without looking up from her sandwich, her voice bored and mechanical, like she'd said these exact words 1,000 times before and would say them 1,000 times again before she retired or died or escaped Pine Ridge for somewhere better. Blake needed witnesses to his version of reality, needed other officers to hear his narrative and accept it and corroborate it when questions started being asked. So he listed off charges in a voice that was deliberately loud and theatrical: resisting arrest, disorderly conduct, possession of narcotics with intent to distribute, and impersonating a peace officer. Found her driving a suspicious vehicle, acted erratically when I attempted a lawful traffic stop, claimed to be some kind of federal agent, but had no credentials to support the claim. He shoved Serena toward the booking counter, and the metal edge caught her in the hip hard enough to leave a bruise, and he commanded her to empty her pockets. And when Serena pointed out that she couldn't empty her pockets while her hands were cuffed behind her back, Blake unlocked one cuff with movements that were deliberately painful, twisting her wrist and applying pressure to the ulnar nerve until Serena had to bite her lip to keep from crying out. She began emptying her pockets slowly and carefully, placing each item on the counter with deliberate precision: a crumpled receipt from a gas station, a hair tie, a piece of wrapped candy, and Blake snatched each item away like he was collecting evidence of some great crime instead of just the mundane contents of a woman's pockets. "Take off the hoodie," Blake ordered, and there was something in his voice that suggested this wasn't about procedure or policy, but about humiliation, about stripping away her armor one layer at a time until she stood exposed and vulnerable before him. "I have a t-shirt underneath." "Serena," said her voice level despite the anger building in her chest, like pressure in a volcano that was overdue to erupt. "But it's freezing in here with the air conditioning, and I'd prefer to keep my hoodie on if that's acceptable." I said, "Take it off." Blake repeated louder this time, establishing dominance through volume, the way bullies always did when they couldn't establish it through logic or reason. "We need to check for tattoos, gang affiliations, track marks, anything that might tell us who you really are and what you're really about." Serena complied, slowly pulling the gray hoodie over her head, with movements that were made awkward by her still sore shoulder, and underneath she wore a plain black tactical t-shirt that was fitted enough to show the definition in her arms, the result of years of Quantico training and daily gym sessions that had built the kind of functional strength that came from preparing your body to fight and win in situations where losing meant dying. Deputy Vance, the lanky officer who'd been processing the drunk driver, looked over and made an observation that should have raised red flags for anyone paying attention. She looks pretty fit for a junkie. Blake, most of the addicts we bring in here are skin and bones or bloated from malnutrition, but she's got muscle definition, like she works out regularly and eats clean. Blake dismissed the observation with a wave of his hand and an explanation that was pure invention. She's a runner, probably runs drugs across state lines for one of the cartels, keeps in shape, because the job requires it. And look at her eyes. Look at how glassy they are. She's definitely high on something right now. Probably came down from a meth binge, and that's why she's so agitated. Serena turned and stared directly at the camera mounted in the corner of the booking area, the one with the small red light that indicated it was actively recording, and she spoke clearly and loudly enough that there could be no mistaking her words or the seriousness of her tone. My name is Special Agent Serena M. Voss Badge number 47821, assigned to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Public Corruption Task Force, operating out of the New Orleans field office, and I am being held against my will by Officer Blake Thornton of the Pine Ridge Police Department, who has stolen my credentials, which are currently located in his right front pocket, where I watched him place them after removing them from my vehicle without authorization. I am requesting immediate contact with my supervisors, and I am demanding that someone call the New Orleans FBI office to verify my identity before this situation escalates further. The room went absolutely silent in the wake of Serena's statement, and Natasha stopped chewing her sandwich mid-bite, and Deputy Vance's eyes went wide with something that looked like panic mixed with disbelief, and everyone turned to look at Blake, whose face had gone from pink to red to a violent shade of purple that suggested his blood pressure had just spiked to dangerous levels. Blake lunged forward and slammed Serena chest first into the concrete counter with enough force to drive the air from her lungs, and he screamed directly into her ear, with spittle flying from his lips. "Shut up! Shut your lying mouth! She's hallucinating! She's delusional! I told you she was on something. She probably watched too many cop shows and thinks if she claims to be FBI, we'll just let her walk out of here." He looked at Vance with eyes that were wild and desperate, and he said with the kind of authority that demanded obedience without question, "Help me get her to the holding cell. She's combative and she's a danger to herself and others. She needs to cool off in isolation before we can safely process her." "Don't we need to print her first?" Vance asked, his voice uncertain because this was deviating from standard procedure in ways that made him uncomfortable even if he couldn't quite articulate why. "Take her mugshot, get her basic information entered into the system, all the normal booking protocols. Later." Blake barked, and his voice had risen to a shout, now had transformed into the verbal equivalent of a physical assault. "She's too combative right now. We'll do all that after she's had a few hours to calm down and come down from whatever drugs she's on now. Help me move her before she hurts herself, or one of us." Blake and Vance grabbed Serena by her arms and dragged her down a narrow hallway lined with heavy steel doors that had small reinforced glass windows set at eye level, each door leading to a holding cell that was basically a concrete box with a metal bench and a toilet, and nothing else. No comfort, no privacy, no acknowledgement that the people locked inside were still human beings with rights and dignity that deserved to be respected. They stopped at cell 6, and Blake unlocked it with keys that jangled against his belt, and he threw the door open so hard it slammed against the concrete wall with a boom that echoed through the entire hallway, and he shoved Serena inside with both hands, pushing her forward so violently that she stumbled and almost fell. Serena caught her balance at the last second and spun around to face Blake, and her voice when she spoke was soft and cold and absolutely certain. "This is the last mistake you'll ever make. Blake Thornton, the last decision you'll make as a free man. Because from this moment forward, your life belongs to the federal justice system, and I promise you that we are far less forgiving than whatever local prosecutor you're used to dealing with." Blake slammed the door shut, and the heavy clank of the lock sliding into place echoed like a gunshot in the confined space, and he peered through the small, reinforced glass window at Serena standing in the middle of her cell, and he whispered just loud enough for her to hear through the door. "Nobody's coming for you. You're just a number now, just another criminal who thought she was smarter than the system, and by the time we're done processing you and manufacturing the evidence we need, everyone's going to believe you're exactly what I say you are." He turned and walked away with his heart hammering against his ribs so hard he could feel it in his throat, could taste the copper tang of adrenaline and fear on his tongue, and he knew without admitting it to himself that he needed to see Chief Wheeler immediately, needed to get ahead of this situation before it spiraled completely out of control, needed to transform this disaster into something manageable before the walls started closing in and crushing him under the weight of his own terrible decisions. Chief of Police Graham Wheeler was a man who believed deeply in order, but only casually in law, who understood that rules were tools to be used when they benefited you and ignored when they didn't. And he sat in his office on the second floor reviewing budget documents that showed how he'd been carefully skimming money from the Asset Forfeiture Fund for the past 4 years, hiding the theft through creative accounting and carefully timed deletions of electronic records that might have proven his guilt if anyone bothered to look closely enough. The office smelled of cigar smoke, even though smoking in government buildings had been banned for 2 decades, and lemon polish that the cleaning crew used on the cheap wood paneling that covered the walls and the shelves were lined with awards from the Rotary Club and plaques from the Chamber of Commerce, and photographs of Wheeler shaking hands with the mayor and the governor and various other politicians who valued loyalty over competence and were happy to overlook small-town corruption as long as it didn't make headlines or embarrass them during election years. Blake burst through the door without knocking, his face pale and slick with sweat, his hands shaking visibly as he closed the door behind him and turned the lock with fingers that fumbled the mechanism twice before managing to secure it, and Wheeler looked up from his paperwork with thick gray eyebrows knitting together in an expression that was equal parts annoyance and concern. "Blake Thornton Wheeler said, drawing out each syllable like he was tasting something unpleasant, you better have a fire directly behind you if you think it's acceptable to barge into my office like this without scheduling an appointment or showing even the most basic level of professional courtesy." "Chief, we have a problem," Blake said, and his voice was trembling in a way that Wheeler had never heard before, had never witnessed in all the years he'd known this arrogant young officer who usually strutted around like he owned the world. "We have a serious problem, and I need your help to fix it before it destroys both of us." Wheeler leaned back in his leather chair, and the hinges creaked in protest, and he steepled his fingers under his chin and said with the kind of dangerous calm that suggested violence was being held in check by the thinnest possible margin. I don't recall being on patrol with you today, Blake. I don't recall making any traffic stops or conducting any arrests that might have created problems. So perhaps you'd like to clarify exactly what you mean when you say, we have a problem, instead of admitting that you have a problem and you're trying to drag me down with you. Blake reached into his pocket with a hand that couldn't stop shaking, and he pulled out the black leather wallet with the Department of Justice seal embossed in gold on the cover, and he placed it on Wheeler's mahogany desk with a movement that was almost reverent, like he was handling a religious artifact that might curse him just for touching it. Wheeler stared at the wallet for a long moment without moving, and then he reached out slowly and flipped it open with one finger, and he read the text inside and looked at the photograph, and then looked up at Blake with eyes that had gone cold and hard and absolutely murderous. "Where did you get this?" Wheeler asked, and his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more menace than any shout could have conveyed. "Highway 9. Blake stammered the words, tumbling out in a rush like water breaking through a damn routine traffic stop. Suspicious vehicle with plates that came back as no record found. And she, the driver. She said she was federal. But Chief, you had to see her. She looked like trash old beat-up car hoodie with stains on it, the kind of person we pull over every day, and I thought she was lying. I thought she was just some junkie trying to talk her way out of trouble, so I cuffed her and I brought her in, and then I found this in her glove compartment after I'd already arrested her. After you'd already arrested her, Wheeler repeated, and the words hung in the air like an indictment. Which means you found exculpatory evidence that proved she was exactly who she said she was, and instead of releasing her immediately and apologizing profusely and hoping she'd be merciful enough not to destroy your career, you... What exactly did you do, Blake? Blake couldn't meet Wheeler's eyes, couldn't face the judgment he saw there, and he stared at his shoes like they were the most interesting thing in the world and said in a voice so small it was barely audible. I kept it. I put it in my pocket, and I told Dalton I hadn't found anything, and I brought her here, and I booked her on charges that I'm going to have to manufacture evidence to support. And, Chief, if I admit now that she's an agent, I'm finished. She'll sue the department for everything we have. She'll have me arrested. She'll make sure I never work in law enforcement again, and I can't. I can't let that happen, not after everything I've worked for. Wheeler stood up slowly and walked to the window that overlooked the parking lot, and he could see the tow truck dragging a beat-up Honda Civic into the impound yard, and he knew something that Blake didn't know, something that made this situation infinitely worse than the young officer realized. For months there had been rumors circulating through the network of chiefs and sheriffs who communicated through encrypted channels and private meetings. Rumors that the FBI had a public corruption task force operating in Louisiana, that they were building cases against small-town departments that had been allowed to run wild for too long without oversight or accountability, and Wheeler had dismissed those rumors as paranoia, had convinced himself that Pine Ridge was too small and too insignificant to attract federal attention. But now he understood with absolute certainty that he'd been wrong. That this woman wasn't some random agent who happened to be passing through. She was a hunter who'd been stalking them for months, and Blake, in his infinite stupidity, had just grabbed the hunter by the throat and given her every reason to call in the full force of the federal government to annihilate them all. "Did anyone else see this badge?" Wheeler asked without turning away from the window, his voice carefully controlled because he needed to know exactly how deep they were before he could decide whether to try swimming to the surface or just let himself drown. "No," Blake said quickly, desperately. "Dalton was there at the stop, but he didn't see me find it. I told him there was nothing in the car, and I made sure to angle my body camera away so the footage won't show anything useful, and nobody in booking saw it because I put it in my pocket before I came inside." Wheeler let out a long sigh that seemed to carry the weight of every bad decision he'd ever made, every corner he'd cut, every rule he'd broken in his 28 years as a police officer, and he rubbed his temples with fingers that were starting to develop arthritis, and he turned back to face Blake with an expression that was hard to read, something between resignation and determination, between accepting defeat and choosing to fight even when the battle was already lost. "You just handed them the keys to the city," Blake Wheeler said, and there was no anger in his voice now, just a tired acceptance of reality. "You arrested a federal agent who's part of a RICO investigation. And do you even know what RICO means? It's the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, which means they aren't just coming after you for what you did today. They're coming after all of us. They're going to use you as the entry point to dismantle this entire department piece by piece." Wheeler picked up this badge and turned it over in his hands, studying it from every angle like he was trying to find some flaw or imperfection that would prove it was fake, that would give him permission to dismiss it and continue believing the comfortable lies he'd been telling himself. But the badge was real, unmistakably and undeniably real, and Wheeler had been a cop long enough to recognize the genuine article when he saw it. He had a choice to make now, a decision that would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of every officer in the Pine Ridge Police Department, and the two paths stretching out before him were both terrible in different ways. He could release Serena Voss immediately, apologize profusely, offer her whatever cooperation she wanted with her investigation, and hope that showing remorse and contrition would earn them some degree of mercy from the federal prosecutors who would inevitably review the case. Or he could double down on Blake's lie manufacture evidence to support their false narrative, and hope that they could bury Serena's credibility under enough fabricated charges that a jury might actually believe she was a criminal pretending to be an agent, rather than an agent being framed by criminals. The first option was sensible, logical, the kind of damage control that any competent administrator would recommend. But Wheeler knew from experience that the FBI didn't show mercy to corrupt cops, didn't accept apologies as substitutes for accountability, and even if they managed to avoid criminal charges by cooperating fully, the civil lawsuits and the federal consent decrees and the complete reorganization of the department would still happen, would still destroy everything he'd built over the past decade, would still expose all the money he'd stolen and all the corners he'd cut and all the policies he'd ignored in favor of letting his officers do whatever they wanted, as long as they brought in revenue through traffic stops and asset forfeitures. The second option was insane reckless. The kind of decision that would only make sense if you'd already accepted that you were going down and decided that your only chance of survival was to sink your opponent faster than they could sink you. But Wheeler had spent his entire career making insane decisions and watching them pay off more often than they should have, and his gambler's instinct told him that sometimes the only way to win was to bet everything on a single hand and hope that luck favored the bold. "She's dirty," Wheeler said suddenly, and the words came out with the kind of finality that suggested he'd made his decision and wasn't interested in debate or discussion. Blake blinked, confused, because that wasn't the response he'd expected. "What do you mean, she's dirty?" "I mean that badge is stolen, or she's a rogue agent working outside her authority, or she's dirty and we caught her in the middle of something illegal, and now she's trying to use her position to escape consequences," Wheeler said, and he was building the narrative in real time, constructing the lie brick by brick and watching it take shape before his eyes. "That's the story we're going to tell. That's the version of events that we're going to support with evidence and testimony and everything else. We need to make people believe us instead of her." "But Chief, she's not dirty," Blake protested, and there was something almost admirable in his unwillingness to take this final step, even though he'd already committed multiple felonies and was in no position to claim the moral high ground. "I arrested her on a routine traffic stop. She didn't do anything except claim to be an agent and tell me to check her credentials, and I'm the one who—" "She is dirty if we say she is." Wheeler roared, and he slammed his fist down on the desk hard enough to make the pens jump and the lamp rattle. "Because the alternative is that we admit you kidnapped a federal agent and I helped you cover it up. And do you understand what that means? Do you comprehend the consequences we'll face if we go down that road? You'll get 20 years minimum for kidnapping a law enforcement officer, and I'll get 10 for conspiracy and obstruction, and every single arrest we've ever made will be reviewed and potentially overturned, and every case we've ever prosecuted will be questioned, and the lawsuits will bankrupt the city and our families will suffer for our mistakes. So, you tell me, Blake, is that the outcome you want?" Blake stared at Wheeler with wide eyes, and he felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, watching the ground crumble beneath his feet, knowing that the fall was coming, but not knowing how to stop it. And in that moment of desperate confusion, Wheeler's certainty felt like a lifeline, felt like the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become quicksand. Wheeler unlocked the bottom drawer of his desk and reached inside, and when his hand emerged, it was holding a small, clear plastic bag filled with white powder that sparkled slightly under the fluorescent lights. Cocaine that had been confiscated from a dealer 3 months ago during a traffic stop and had never been logged into evidence had instead been kept in Wheeler's personal stash for exactly this kind of situation, for moments when manufacturing probable cause required actual physical evidence instead of just invented testimony. He tossed the bag to Blake, and it arced through the air and landed in the younger officer's hands with a weight that was both physical and metaphorical, the weight of a decision that couldn't be undone once it was made. Get to the impound lot right now." Wheeler commanded, his voice dropping to the kind of dangerous whisper that made every word feel like a threat. "Find her car. Plant this under the driver's seat as deep as you can hide it. Make it look like she's been moving product for one of the cartels. Create a narrative that explains why a federal agent would be dirty, why she'd use her position to traffic drugs, why we were right to arrest her, even if we didn't know exactly what we were stopping when we made the initial contact." Blake stared at the bag in his hands like it was a live snake, like it might bite him if he held it too long, and he understood with perfect clarity that taking this cocaine to the impound lot and planting it in Serena's car was the point of no return, was the moment where he transformed from a cop who'd made mistakes into a criminal who deserved prison. But the alternative was admitting his guilt and facing consequences that terrified him more than any prison sentence ever could. "Chief, if we do this, there's no going back. There's no way to undo it once it's done, and if they catch us, they won't catch us. If you do exactly what I tell you." Wheeler interrupted, and his voice carried the absolute certainty of a man who'd been getting away with crimes for so long that he'd forgotten it was possible to be held accountable. "Because I've been doing this for 30 years, Blake. I've been manufacturing evidence and manipulating investigations and protecting my officers from consequences of their actions since before you were born, and I know how to make this work. If you just trust me and follow my instructions exactly as I give them." Blake clutched the bag of cocaine and felt his heart racing so fast he thought it might explode, and he nodded, even though every instinct in his body was screaming that this was wrong, that they should stop now, while they still could, that adding more crimes on top of the crimes they'd already committed wouldn't save them, but would only dig the hole deeper until they could never climb out. But Wheeler was his chief, his mentor, the man who'd taken him under his wing when nobody else believed in him, and Blake had been trained his entire career to follow orders from superior officers, even when those orders didn't make sense, even when they contradicted everything he'd learned in the academy about ethics and integrity and doing the right thing regardless of personal cost. "Yes, sir," Blake said, and the words felt like ashes in his mouth, felt like he was speaking his own epitaph and signing his name to a death warrant that he'd written himself. And Blake Wheeler added his voice, dropping even lower into a register that suggested violence being held in check by the thinnest possible thread of self-control. "Delete the body cam footage from the traffic stop. Hard. Delete it so that it can't be recovered by forensic analysis. Corrupt the file completely so that when they inevitably ask for it, we can tell them there was a technical malfunction and the footage never recorded properly in the first place." Blake nodded again and turned toward the door, his legs feeling like they were made of water, like they might collapse under him at any second and leave him sprawling on the floor of Wheeler's office, unable to do anything except wait for the consequences to arrive and destroy him. But he made it to the door and got it open and stumbled out into the hallway, and he heard Wheeler call after him one more time. "This saves both of us. Blake, remember that when you're doing what needs to be done, remember that we're protecting each other and protecting this department and protecting all the good work we've done over the years. And sometimes that means making hard choices that weak men couldn't make." Blake rushed down the stairs and out the back door toward the impound lot, and with every step he took he felt like he was walking deeper into quicksand, felt like he was sinking into something that would eventually swallow him whole. But he couldn't stop. Now. Couldn't turn back. Couldn't do anything except keep moving forward and hope that somehow impossibly this would all work out and he'd wake up tomorrow still a police officer instead of a defendant awaiting trial. Cell 6 at the Pine Ridge Police Department was a concrete box approximately 8 feet by 10 feet containing a thin mattress on a metal frame that was bolted to the wall, a stainless steel toilet with no seat that was positioned in the corner without any privacy screen, and absolutely nothing else except fluorescent lights that hummed constantly and never turned off, creating a timeless purgatory where day and night ceased to have meaning. And the only way to measure time was by counting heartbeats or breaths or the number of times you wondered if anyone would ever come to let you out. Serena Voss sat on the edge of the mattress with her back against the cold concrete wall, and she wasn't pacing or yelling or banging on the door, demanding to be released the way most people would have been doing in her situation. And instead, she sat perfectly still with her eyes closed and her breathing controlled, and to anyone watching through the small window in the door, it would have looked like she was sleeping or giving up or accepting her fate with quiet resignation. But Serena wasn't sleeping, and she definitely wasn't giving up. She was meditating, centering herself, running through the operational protocols that had been drilled into her during 16 weeks at Quantico and reinforced through 8 years of field experience. And what she was visualizing was this: every FBI agent assigned to undercover operations or extended field work was required to maintain what the Bureau called a dead man switch, an automated system that monitored their status and triggered alerts if they failed to check in according to their scheduled protocol. For Serena, that protocol required her to open a specific encrypted app on her phone every 4 hours and input a specific code that confirmed she was safe and operational. And if she missed a check-in window, the system would automatically escalate through a series of responses. First, a yellow alert that notified her immediate supervisor that she'd missed contact. Then an orange alert if she missed a second consecutive window. And finally a red alert if she went 8 hours without checking in, at which point the full weight of the FBI's emergency response protocols would activate, and they'd start tracking her phone's GPS location and deploying resources to investigate why one of their agents had gone dark. Serena checked the time by counting backwards from when Blake had pulled her over. That was 4:15 p.m. based on the position of the sun, and her last check-in had been at noon, which meant her next scheduled check-in should have been at 4 p.m., which meant she'd already missed her window by at least 30 minutes. Which meant right now, at this very moment, analysts at the New Orleans field office were looking at her file and seeing a yellow alert and trying to ping her phone to verify her location. And when they did, they'd see that her phone was stationary inside the Pine Ridge Police Department building, which would immediately trigger questions about why an undercover agent investigating police corruption had ended up inside the station. She was supposed to be investigating, and those questions would escalate rapidly, because missing check-ins weren't treated casually, weren't dismissed as forgetfulness or technical glitches, but were instead handled as potential emergencies that required immediate attention and rapid response. Serena smiled in the darkness of her cell, and it wasn't a happy smile or a triumphant smile, but rather the cold, satisfied smile of a chess player who'd just realized that their opponent had walked directly into a trap without seeing it until it was too late to escape. Because Blake Thornton and Chief Wheeler thought they were in control of this situation, thought they could manage the narrative and manufacture evidence and make Serena disappear into the criminal justice system, where she'd just be another black woman whose claims of innocence would be dismissed as the desperate lies of someone trying to avoid responsibility for their crimes. But what they didn't understand, what they couldn't possibly know, because they'd never operated at the level where federal law enforcement played. The game was that Serena wasn't alone, wasn't isolated, wasn't a lone agent who could be silenced or disappeared without consequences. She listened carefully to the sounds filtering through the heavy steel door of her cell, and she could hear boots hurrying down the hallway with a tempo that suggested urgency or panic. Could hear the distant murmur of angry voices discussing something in tones that carried stress. Even if the specific words were inaudible, could hear all the telltale signs of an organization that had just realized they'd made a terrible mistake and were now trying desperately to figure out how to contain the damage before it spiraled completely out of control. Good, Serena whispered to herself, her voice barely audible even in the silence of her concrete cell. Panic makes people sloppy, makes them rush instead of thinking carefully, makes them compound their initial mistakes with additional errors that create more evidence and more witnesses and more opportunities for justice to break through the walls they try to build around their corruption. A voice from the cell next to hers interrupted her thoughts. A rough male voice singing a gospel song in a way that suggested he'd learned the hymn in church as a child and still remembered every word, even after whatever journey had brought him to this place. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. Serena called out softly through the concrete wall that separated them, projecting her voice just loud enough to be heard by her neighbor, but not loud enough to alert any officers who might be monitoring the hallway. "Hey, neighbor, can you hear me?" The singing stopped abruptly, and there was a moment of silence before the rough voice responded with suspicion and curiosity mixed together. "Who's that?" "They put someone new in cell 6. Usually that one's empty, unless they got someone they want to keep isolated." "My name is Serena, and I need you to do me a favor," she said, choosing her words carefully because she needed this man to trust her, needed him to believe her story. Even though it probably sounded insane, needed him to be willing to remember and repeat what she was about to tell him. "I ain't got no cigarettes if that's what you're asking for," the voice said. "And I don't have any commissary money either. So if you're trying to trade for something, I can't help you." "I don't need cigarettes or money," Serena assured him. "I just need you to remember something for me. And if you can do that, if you can remember what I'm about to tell you and repeat it to the right people when they ask, I can get your charges dropped. I know the U.S. attorney personally, and I can make sure you walk out of here without any conviction on your record." The man laughed, and it was a bitter sound that suggested he'd heard plenty of promises before and watched them all dissolve into nothing. "Yeah, right. You're locked in a cell just like me. You're in the same cage as everyone else in this place. So what makes you think you have any power to get anyone's charges dropped?" "I'm not like you," Serena said, and there was no arrogance in her voice, just a statement of fact delivered with the kind of certainty that made it impossible not to believe. "I'm not someone who got arrested for breaking the law. I'm someone who was arrested for being the law. And when my people come for me, and they are coming, this entire department is going to burn to the ground. And the only question is whether you want to be remembered as someone who helped justice happen or someone who stayed quiet when they had a chance to do the right thing." There was a long silence from the next cell, and then the man's voice came back quieter, more thoughtful, tinged with something that might have been hope or might have been fear. "What do you need me to remember?" Serena took a breath and spoke clearly, creating a testimony that would later prove crucial. "When Officer Blake Thornton brought me into this station, he didn't book me properly. He didn't fingerprint me, didn't photograph me, didn't follow any of the standard procedures that he would have followed if this was a legitimate arrest. And instead, he dragged me straight to this cell and threw me inside. And I need you to remember that, because when they ask you later what you heard and saw, that detail is going to prove that Blake knew he'd made a mistake and was trying to hide me away before anyone could question what he'd done." "I heard him yelling," the man admitted. "Heard him saying you were high on drugs and needed to cool off. Heard him tell another officer to help him get you to the cells quick before you hurt yourself or someone else." "I'm not high," Serena said firmly. "I'm FB. I'm a federal agent investigating this department for corruption, and Blake Thornton just made the worst mistake of his life by arresting me and stealing my credentials. And when my team arrives to extract me from this situation, I'm going to need you to tell them exactly what you heard, exactly what time you heard it, exactly how Blake was acting when he brought me in here." Another long silence, and then a low whistle of amazement. "Damn, you're really FB. Like for real. Federal agent. For real." Serena confirmed. "And here's what's going to happen within the next few hours. Maybe sooner. You're going to hear a lot of activity, a lot of shouting and movement and boots running through these hallways. And when that happens, I need you to start yelling that there's a federal agent in cell 6. I need you to make noise and draw attention and make sure that every officer in this building knows I'm here and knows my status, because the more witnesses we have to what happens next, the harder it will be for them to cover up their crimes." "I can do that," the man said, and there was determination in his voice now. "I can make some noise. When the time comes, my name's Terrell, by the way. Terrell Washington, And I want you to know that I'm not in here for anything violent. Just had some outstanding traffic tickets that turned into a warrant. So if you really can help me get this cleared up, I'd appreciate it. Consider it done, Terrell, Serena said. And she meant it because part of being an FBI agent was recognizing that the system trapped plenty of innocent people alongside the guilty ones, that minor infractions could cascade into major consequences if you didn't have money for a good lawyer, or connections to someone who could help navigate the bureaucracy when this is over and my people have taken control of this station. I'll personally make sure your tickets get dismissed and you walk out of here free and clear. Then I got your back, Terrell said simply. And Serena closed her eyes and leaned her head against the concrete wall and thought about her daughter Kiana, about how scared she must be right now if Gloria had called to tell her that Mommy wasn't home yet, and something had gone wrong, and Serena made a silent promise to herself and to her daughter that she would get through this, would survive. It would use every bit of training and experience and righteous fury she possessed to make sure that Blake Thornton and Graham Wheeler and every other corrupt officer in this department paid the full price for thinking they could break the law while wearing a badge. Sit tight. Terrell Serena called out one more time. The show's about to start, and you're going to have a front row seat to what happens when people who abuse power finally run into someone who has the authority and the will to hold them accountable. The impound lot behind the Pine Ridge Police Department sat baking under the relentless Louisiana sun, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire that gleamed like broken glass. And the rows of seized vehicles parked in neat lines told silent stories of traffic stops gone wrong and asset forfeitures that had stripped people of their property without ever charging them with crimes, and Blake Thornton walked among these metal tombstones with the bag of cocaine burning in his pocket like a live coal, like something that might explode at any moment and take him with it. The lot was empty except for a mangy, stray dog that had somehow gotten inside the fence and was picking through an overturned trash can near the far corner, and Blake was grateful for the solitude, because what he was about to do required privacy, required the absence of witnesses who might later testify about what they'd seen. Required darkness, even though the sun was still blazing overhead and wouldn't set for another 3 hours. He found Serena's Honda Civic parked in the corner where the tow truck had deposited it, and the car looked even more pathetic in the harsh sunlight than it had on the highway. The paint faded and chipped, the bumper held on with what looked like duct tape and prayers, the interior visible through the windows showing the detritus of someone who either lived in their vehicle or wanted people to think they did. Blake looked around one more time to make absolutely certain he was alone, and then he pulled on a pair of latex gloves from the box he kept in his duty belt, the same gloves he'd use at a legitimate crime scene. Except this time he was the criminal, and the crime scene was one he was actively creating, and his hands were shaking so badly that it took 3 tries to get the second glove on properly. He opened the driver's door, and the hinges creaked in protest, and Blake climbed inside and immediately started sweating even more than he already was, because the car's interior had been turned into an oven by hours sitting in direct sunlight, and he pulled up the floor mat on the driver's side and stared at the carpet underneath, trying to decide exactly where to place the cocaine so it would look like it had been there for a while but would still be discoverable when crime scene techs inevitably searched the vehicle. He pulled out his pocket knife and made a small slit in the carpet lining near where it met the metal frame of the floor, and he worked his fingers into the gap and expanded it until there was enough room to slide the plastic bag inside, and then he pushed the cocaine as deep into the cavity as he could reach, tucking it behind insulation and foam padding until only a corner of the bag was visible if you knew exactly where to look and were specifically searching for it. Blake stood up and wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, and he looked down at his handiwork and tried to convince himself that this would work, that crime scene investigators would find the cocaine and assume Serena had hidden it there herself, that prosecutors would see the drugs and decide she was exactly what Blake had claimed she was, a criminal using a fake badge to escape consequences. But somewhere deep in his mind, a voice that sounded suspiciously like his mother's was screaming that this was wrong, that he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, that he'd transformed himself from someone who made mistakes into someone who manufactured evidence and destroyed lives through deliberate malice rather than accidental ignorance. He pulled out his radio and keyed the microphone, and his voice when he spoke was steadier than he felt was pitched to convey professional detachment and routine procedure rather than the terror and guilt that were actually churning through his guts like acid. Dispatch. This is Blake. I'm at the impound lot conducting an inventory search of the suspect vehicle from my earlier traffic stop, and I've discovered something that looks like a significant quantity of narcotics, possibly cocaine concealed under the driver's seat in a way that suggests deliberate trafficking rather than personal use. Natasha's voice crackled back through the radio speakers, and she sounded bored and unsurprised because drug finds were common enough in Pine Ridge that they barely registered as newsworthy anymore. Copy that, Blake. You need a crime scene unit to come process the vehicle and photograph the evidence in situ before you collect it. Yeah, Blake said, and he was committing, now was burning the last bridge that might have led back to some version of redemption. Send the CSI team and tell Chief Wheeler that we've got her dead to rights. Tell him the evidence supports everything. I put in my initial report and then some. Blake locked the car and started walking back toward the station with his hands still trembling inside the latex gloves, and he felt simultaneously lighter and heavier, like he'd just set down a crushing burden, but picked up an even worse one in its place, and he told himself that this was necessary, that Wheeler was right about needing to protect themselves and protect the department, that sometimes doing the right thing for the organization meant doing things that felt wrong in the moment, but would be justified by the results in the long run. But even as Blake repeated these rationalizations like a mantra, even as he tried to convince himself that he was still fundamentally a good person who'd just been forced into a difficult situation by circumstances beyond his control, he couldn't escape the growing certainty that he'd just made a terrible mistake, that the cocaine in Serena's car wasn't going to save him, but would instead become one more piece of evidence proving his guilt when this whole house of cards inevitably collapsed. What Blake didn't know, what his arrogance and his panic and his absolute lack of imagination prevented him from considering even for a moment, was that high above him at an altitude of approximately 15,000 feet, a surveillance drone operated by the FBI's Technical Services Division was hovering in a slow circle with its high-resolution camera pointed directly at the impound lot, recording everything in 4K clarity with metadata stamps that would later prove exactly when each action occurred and who performed it. The drone had been tracking Serena's vehicle since she'd left New Orleans that morning, maintaining visual contact while staying high enough to be invisible to the naked eye, and when the car had been towed to the impound lot, the drone had simply adjusted its position and continued recording, capturing Blake's arrival. His furtive glances to check for witnesses, his use of gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints, his deliberate cutting of the carpet to create a hiding place, and most damningly, the moment when he pulled the bag of white powder from his pocket and pushed it deep into the cavity he'd created. And even further away in a high-tech command center located in the New Orleans FBI field office, a team of analysts and agents were gathered around a large monitor watching this footage in real time, and their expressions ranged from anger to amazement to the kind of grim satisfaction that comes from watching criminals incriminate themselves so thoroughly that no defense attorney in the world would be able to create reasonable doubt in a jury's mind. Special Agent in Charge. Dominic Kane was not a man given to emotional outbursts or theatrical displays of anger, having learned over 23 years with the Bureau that the most effective leaders were the ones who remained calm under pressure and channeled their rage into productive action rather than wasting it on shouting or throwing things. But as he watched the monitor showing Officer Blake Thornton planting cocaine in Serena Voss's vehicle, the veins in his neck were bulging, and his jaw was clenched so tightly that his teeth were starting to ache from the pressure. Kane was tall and broad-shouldered with close-cropped gray hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite by a sculptor who believed that weakness was a design flaw to be eliminated. And he stood behind the analyst's chair with his hands gripped into fists at his sides. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low and deadly calm, in a way that made everyone in the room understand that someone was about to experience the full weight of federal justice descending on their head like the hammer of an angry god. "Rewind that," Kane ordered, and the analyst named Kira, who was operating the drone controls, tapped her keyboard with fingers that flew across the keys so fast they blurred, and the footage on the screen reversed, showing Blake walking backward out of the car, the cocaine bag emerging from the floor cavity and returning to his pocket. Time running in the wrong direction until they were back at the moment when Blake first approached the vehicle with his box of latex gloves. "Play it again from the beginning," Kane said, "and this time I want you to zoom in on his hands so we can see exactly what he's doing, so there's no possible ambiguity or room for his lawyer to claim this was anything other than deliberate evidence fabrication." The footage played again this time with the camera digitally zoomed in so that Blake's hands filled most of the screen and they could see in perfect clarity the moment when he pulled the plastic bag from his pocket, could see the white powder inside, catching the sunlight and sparkling like snow, could see him carefully positioning it in the cavity he'd cut, could see him arranging the carpet to partially conceal it while still leaving it discoverable for anyone who knew where to look. Kira paused the playback at the exact moment when the bag was most visible, when both Blake's hands and the cocaine were in frame together, and she said with disgust heavy in her voice, "He planted it clear as day. No question. No ambiguity. We have him on 4K resolution with metadata, timestamps that will prove exactly when this happened, and geographic coordinates that will prove exactly where. And there's literally no defense he can offer that will overcome this evidence." "Where's Agent Voss right now?" Kane asked, and his voice had shifted from angry to operational, had transformed from someone reacting to an outrage into someone planning a response with military precision. GPS from her phone puts it stationary in the Pine Ridge Police Department parking lot. Kira reported, pulling up a second screen that showed a satellite view of the station with a red dot pulsing where Serena's phone signal was originating. But her biometric watch, which she's required to wear during all field operations and which hasn't been removed from her wrist, is showing elevated heart rate and stress indicators consistent with someone in a hostile situation, and the watch's accelerometer data shows she's been stationary for the past 47 minutes. Which suggests she's either sitting or lying down and not moving around freely. "She's in a holding cell," Kane said, and it wasn't a question but a statement of fact based on years of experience reading between the lines of data and understanding what information meant. When you put all the pieces together, they've arrested her and they're holding her somewhere in that building, probably trying to figure out what to do next now that they've realized they've kidnapped a federal agent and don't have any good options for how to escape the consequences. Kane turned to face the room full of agents who had been assembling and preparing while he'd been focused on the monitor, and he saw them strapping on tactical vests and checking magazines and loading weapons, and he felt a surge of pride mixed with fury, because these were his people. Serena was one of his agents, and the Pine Ridge Police Department had just declared war on the FBI, without understanding that wars between local cops and federal law enforcement only ever ended one way. "Listen up." Kane barked, his voice cutting through the controlled chaos of the command center like a blade through silk. "We have confirmation that a local police officer has kidnapped a federal agent and is currently in the process of fabricating evidence to frame her for drug trafficking. And this is no longer an investigation. This is a rescue operation, and we are going to execute it with overwhelming force and absolute precision." He paused and looked each agent in the eye, making sure they understood the gravity of what he was about to say. "Air support is already en route from our aviation unit at Lakefront Airport. SWAT is mobilizing from the Baton Rouge field office and should arrive at our staging area within 90 minutes. And I want this precinct surrounded so completely that a mouse couldn't escape without us knowing about it. No one leaves that building. No one enters that building. No communication goes in or out, except through channels we control. And we are going to take this entire department down, brick by brick, until we've accounted for every officer and every piece of evidence and every lie they've told." One of the team leaders, a veteran agent named Rodriguez, who'd been with the Bureau even longer than Kane, raised his hand and asked the question everyone was thinking. Rules of engagement. Boss, how do we handle this? If they resist or try to use Agent Voss as leverage. Kane's expression hardened into something that looked like it could cut diamonds, and when he spoke, there was no warmth or mercy in his voice, just cold calculation and absolute certainty. They are armed combatants who have taken a federal law enforcement officer hostage, and if any of them makes a move toward a weapon or attempts to harm Agent Voss in any way, you are authorized to use whatever force is necessary to neutralize the threat. But I want Chief Wheeler and Officer Blake Thornton alive and conscious and capable of standing trial, because I want them to see what happens when you touch one of ours. I want them to watch their careers and their freedom and everything they ever cared about get destroyed in front of their eyes, and I want them to spend the next 20 years in a federal prison thinking about the decision they made today. Let's move. Kane commanded, and the room exploded into coordinated motion as agents grabbed gear and headed for the elevator, and within 3 minutes the first wave of vehicles was pulling out of the FBI field office's underground garage and heading north on Interstate 10 toward Pine Ridge, with lights flashing and sirens wailing, and the machine of federal justice that had been sleeping was now fully awake and absolutely furious. Back in Pine Ridge, the sun had finally begun its slow descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances, but now just felt ominous and threatening, like nature itself was warning that something terrible was about to happen. Chief Wheeler was in his office frantically feeding documents into an industrial shredder that whined and groaned as it consumed evidence of years of corruption, and he had a terrible feeling in his gut that he couldn't quite explain a premonition that had been growing stronger with each passing hour since Blake had brought him that FBI badge, a sense that he'd set in motion events that were now beyond his control and racing toward a conclusion that wouldn't end well for anyone involved. Downstairs in the main booking area, Blake Thornton sat at his desk trying to type up an arrest report that would justify everything he'd done, and he was actually starting to feel better about the situation because the crime scene unit had photographed the cocaine in Serena's car, and it looked perfect. Looked exactly like something a drug trafficker would hide, and Blake had crafted a narrative in his report that made him sound like a hero who'd conducted a textbook traffic stop and discovered a major dealer through excellent police work and keen observation skills. He typed suspect Serena Voss into the name field and began constructing his fictional account of events, describing how she'd been driving erratically, how she'd smelled of marijuana, how she'd become belligerent when he attempted to question her, and how the subsequent search had revealed trafficking quantities of cocaine hidden in her vehicle in a manner consistent with interstate drug transportation. Suddenly, the lights in the station flickered just once, but noticeably, and the fluorescent tubes overhead buzzed and dimmed before coming back to full brightness, and Blake looked up from his computer with a frown creasing his forehead. "Natasha." He called out to the dispatcher, who was still behind her glass partition. "What's going on with the power? Is there a storm moving in or something?" "I don't know," Natasha said, and she sounded uncertain in a way that was unusual for her because normally she maintained absolute composure. No matter what chaos erupted around her, the weather forecast didn't show anything severe, and the backup generators haven't kicked in, so it can't be a complete outage. Probably just a voltage fluctuation from the power company. Then the phone rang, and it wasn't the normal ring of an outside line or the internal intercom system, but rather the direct line that connected to important government offices and high-level officials, the phone that almost never rang except during emergencies or when someone very powerful wanted to speak to Chief Wheeler immediately. Natasha picked it up with a hand that was already starting to tremble before she even heard who was on the other end, and she said in her professional dispatcher voice, "Pine Ridge Police Department. This is..." But she never finished her greeting because whoever was on the other end interrupted her with words that made all the color drain from her face, and she stood up so fast that her chair rolled backward and crashed into the wall behind her, and the headset cord stretched to its maximum length as she turned to look at Blake with eyes that were wide with something approaching terror. "It's Blake. "It's for you," Natasha whispered, and her voice was shaking so badly she could barely get the words out. He says he's the assistant director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and he wants to speak to whoever's in charge down here. Blake felt his heart stop. Actually felt it freeze in his chest for a moment before it started racing at double speed, and his fingers hovered over the keyboard as if they'd been turned to stone, and a cold chill that started at the base of his skull began spreading down his spine like ice water being poured directly onto his nervous system. "Hang up," Blake said, and his voice came out higher and thinner than he intended, betraying the panic that was starting to overwhelm his ability to think clearly. "Just hang up the phone, Natasha. It's obviously a prank. Probably one of the guys from the county sheriff's office trying to mess with us, so just hang up and ignore it." "I can't hang up," Natasha cried, and there were actual tears starting to form in her eyes because she'd been working for Pine Ridge PD long enough to know when something was seriously wrong, when a situation had spiraled from manageable to catastrophic, he says. "Blake, he says to look outside. He says we need to see what's waiting for us before we make any decisions about how this is going to end." Blake stood up slowly, and his legs felt like they were made of jelly, like they might collapse under his weight at any moment, and he walked toward the front glass doors of the station on feet that seemed to belong to someone else, and he told himself that this was nothing, that there would be nothing out there except the normal empty parking lot and the highway beyond and maybe a few cars passing by on their way to somewhere more interesting than Pine Ridge. But when Blake reached the doors and looked out through the glass, what he saw made his brain refuse to process the information for several seconds because it was so far beyond anything he'd expected or imagined that it simply couldn't be real. Couldn't be happening. Had to be some kind of hallucination or nightmare from which he would wake up any moment. The parking lot was no longer empty. Instead, it had been transformed into what looked like a military staging area, with dozens of black SUVs blocking every exit and entrance, their lights flashing in coordinated patterns that created a sea of red and blue that washed across the building's facade like waves breaking against a shore. An armored Bearcat vehicle that looked like it belonged in a war zone rather than a small Louisiana town was idling at the main gate with its engine rumbling loud enough to be heard even through the thick glass of the station doors, and agents in full tactical gear were taking up positions behind the vehicles with rifles that had scopes and night vision attachments and all the other equipment that suggested they were prepared for a prolonged engagement if necessary. And above it all, cutting through the early evening air, with a sound that made Blake's teeth hurt, was a helicopter that circled the building in a slow pattern with its spotlight beam pointed directly down at the station. And the light was so bright that when it swept across Blake's position, it was like being caught in the eye of God, like being seen and judged and found wanting by some higher power that had finally decided to pay attention to all the crimes that had been committed in this building under the protection of badges and the assumption of authority. A voice boomed from a loudspeaker mounted on one of the SUVs, and the volume was so loud that it made the glass doors vibrate in their frames and caused several pictures hanging on the walls inside the station to rattle against their hooks. "This is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This building is completely surrounded. All personnel inside the Pine Ridge Police Department are to exit the building immediately with your hands clearly visible above your heads. You have 2 minutes to comply before we breach the building and extract our agent by force." Blake stumbled backward from the doors and felt his stomach trying to climb up through his throat, and he looked around wildly for Chief Wheeler, for someone to tell him what to do, for some authority figure who could make this nightmare stop and return the world to the comfortable, familiar place it had been just this morning when he'd woken up and gone to the gym and put on his uniform without any idea that by sunset he'd be watching the entire federal government descend on his police station like the wrath of an angry god. "Chief," Blake screamed, and his voice cracked on the word, because his throat was so tight with fear that he could barely force air through it. "Chief Wheeler." "They're here. The feds are everywhere we need to." Wheeler appeared at the top of the stairs, holding a manila folder full of shredded paper fragments that were still falling from his hands like confetti, and his face had gone from its normal ruddy color to a pale gray that made him look like he'd aged 20 years in the past 5 minutes. And when he saw Blake standing by the front doors, he understood immediately, without needing any explanation, what was happening, because he'd spent enough years in law enforcement to recognize the sound of an operation that had moved from investigation to enforcement, from watching and waiting to acting and arresting. "What is that noise?" Wheeler asked, even though he already knew the answer, even though the question was just a way of buying himself a few more seconds before he had to face the reality that was waiting outside. "They're here," Blake said, and the words came out in a rush like water breaking through a dam. "The FBI, hundreds of them, or at least it looks like hundreds. They've got armored vehicles and helicopters, and they're saying we have 2 minutes to come out with our hands up, or they're going to breach the building and extract their agent by force. And Chief, what do we do? How do we fight this? How do we fight them?" Wheeler interrupted, and his voice was filled with a mixture of contempt and despair that made Blake flinch. "You want to fight the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You want to engage in a gunfight with federal agents who have air support and SWAT teams and the full backing of the United States government. Blake, you aren't just stupid. You're suicidal. Because that's not a fight we can win. That's not even a fight we can survive. That's just a way to guarantee we get shot in addition to getting arrested." Every phone in the station started ringing simultaneously, creating a cacophony that sounded like an alarm, or a warning, or the soundtrack to the end of the world, and the noise combined with the helicopter overhead and the loudspeaker outside created a sensory assault that made it impossible to think clearly. Impossible to do anything except react on instinct and hope that those instincts led somewhere other than complete destruction. "Come out or we are breaching." The loudspeaker boomed again, and the voice carried such absolute authority that it didn't sound like a request or even a command, but rather like a prophecy, like a statement of fact about what was definitely going to happen, regardless of what anyone inside the building wanted or decided. Blake looked at Wheeler with eyes that were desperate and pleading, looking for guidance or reassurance or some plan that would make this situation survivable. And Wheeler looked back at him with pure hatred radiating from every line of his face, with an expression that said this was all Blake's fault, that none of this would be happening if the younger officer had just been smarter or more careful or less arrogant in his assumption that he could get away with anything. "What do we do?" Blake asked again, and his voice had risen to something approaching a wail. "We have to fight them. We have to defend ourselves. We can't just surrender and let them take us without." "Put your gun down," Wheeler roared, and he was screaming now too because the stress and the fear had finally broken through his carefully maintained facade of control. "Put your weapon down and open the front doors and let them in. Because fighting the FBI is how you go from 20 years in prison to being buried in a closed casket after they shoot you 17 times for brandishing a weapon at federal agents." But Blake wasn't listening anymore, couldn't hear anything over the roaring in his ears that sounded like static or ocean waves or the sound of his entire life collapsing around him. And instead of following Wheeler's order to stand down and surrender, Blake turned and ran toward the back of the station, toward the holding cells, toward where Serena Voss was locked up and waiting. And somewhere in his panicked, oxygen-deprived brain, an idea was forming that was so desperately stupid it could only have come from someone who'd completely lost the ability to think rationally. If he had Serena Blake's panicked thoughts, whispered if he could get to her cell and bring her out and use her as a shield or a hostage or leverage to negotiate with, then maybe the FBI would back off. Maybe they'd be willing to talk instead of shoot. Maybe he could bargain his way out of this nightmare by offering to release their agent in exchange for safe passage or immunity or something that would let him escape the consequences of what he'd done. It was a terrible plan, a plan that ignored everything Blake should have known about how hostage situations worked and how the FBI responded to threats against their own people. but fear and desperation had reduced Blake's cognitive abilities to something barely above animal instinct, and all he could think about was survival. Escape was finding some way to make this stop before it crushed him completely. "Blake, stop!" Wheeler screamed after him. "Don't you dare make this worse than it already is." But Blake was already through the security door that led to the cell block, was already sprinting down the hallway with his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his temples, could taste copper and adrenaline and terror mixed together in a cocktail that made him want to vomit, but didn't slow him down. He fumbled with his keys as he ran his hands shaking so badly that he dropped them twice before managing to get the right one separated from the ring, and he reached cell 6 and jammed the key into the lock and turned it so hard that for a moment he was afraid it might break off in the mechanism and trap him out here in the hallway when the FBI came crashing through those doors. The lock clicked open and Blake kicked the door inward with enough force that it slammed against the concrete wall and bounced partially closed again, and he stepped into the cell with his hand on his weapon, and his breathing coming in ragged gasps that made spots dance in front of his vision, and he shouted at Serena with all the authority he could muster, even though his voice was shaking. "Get up. Get up. Right now. You're going to walk me out of here. You're going to tell your people to back off and let us through. You're going to—" But Blake never finished his sentence because at that exact moment, the front doors of the Pine Ridge Police Department exploded inward with a sound like a bomb detonating the hinges blown apart by shaped charges that the FBI breaching team had placed with surgical precision, and flashbang grenades went off in rapid succession, filling the lobby with blinding white light and deafening noise that was specifically designed to disorient and incapacitate anyone inside, and the sound of boots hitting the floor was like thunder or drum beats, or the sound of justice finally arriving after being delayed for far too long. FBI, get down. Get down on the ground now. The tactical team moved through the building with practiced efficiency, clearing each room methodically, while other agents secured Chief Wheeler, who had dropped to his knees with his hands raised and was already yelling that he wanted to cooperate, that he wanted immunity in exchange for testimony, that he would tell them everything if they just promised not to charge him with kidnapping. Blake turned his head toward the door of the cell for just a split second, distracted by the cacophony of the breach and the knowledge that the building was being overrun, and his last chance at escape was evaporating like morning dew under the Louisiana sun, and that momentary distraction was all Serena needed, because she'd been waiting for exactly this opportunity, had been preparing herself mentally and physically for the moment when Blake would make a mistake and give her an opening. Serena didn't need a weapon because she'd spent 16 weeks at Quantico learning hand-to-hand combat from instructors who'd been doing this since before she was born, had spent 8 years in the field practicing these techniques until they became muscle memory, until her body could execute the movements without conscious thought, until disarming an armed opponent became as natural as breathing or walking or any other automatic function that didn't require deliberation. She moved with the fluid grace of someone who knew exactly what she was doing, and had done it successfully many times before lunging forward and grabbing the barrel of Blake's service weapon with her left hand, while simultaneously using her right palm to strike him violently under the chin with a blow that snapped his head backward and made his teeth click together with enough force to chip one of his molars. Blake's finger tightened reflexively on the trigger as Serena diverted the barrel away from her center mass, and the gun discharged with a deafening bang that seemed impossibly loud in the confined space of the concrete cell, and the bullet went wild and punched a hole in the ceiling tiles that rained down fragments of acoustic material and dust onto both of them. Serena used Blake's momentary disorientation to sweep his legs out from under him with a move that she'd practiced 10,000 times in training, and Blake went down hard onto the concrete floor with an impact that drove the air from his lungs and left him gasping like a fish pulled from water. Before Blake could even begin to process what had happened or attempt to defend himself, Serena was on top of him with her knee driven into his throat, applying just enough pressure to make breathing difficult, but not enough to actually cause permanent damage. Because even after everything Blake had done to her, even after he'd assaulted her and kidnapped her and tried to frame her for crimes she didn't commit, Serena was still a professional who understood that her job was to arrest criminals and bring them to justice, rather than to exact personal revenge through violence. She wrenched the gun from Blake's hand with a twisting motion that put painful pressure on his wrist, and threatened to break it if he didn't release his grip. And once she had control of the weapon, she tossed it into the hallway where it skittered across the floor and came to rest against the far wall, well out of reach of anyone in the cell. "Don't move!" Serena hissed, and her voice was cold and hard and absolutely devoid of the fear or panic that Blake had expected to hear. "Don't even think about moving, because I have been waiting for hours to do this, and I would love an excuse to make it hurt more than it already does." Blake stared up at her with tears streaming down his face and mixing with the sweat and the dust from the ceiling tiles, and all the arrogance that had defined him for so many years had been stripped away. All the swagger and the confidence and the sense of untouchable authority had evaporated like smoke in wind, and what was left was just a terrified little boy who'd made terrible choices and was now facing consequences that he'd never really believed would come for him. "I'm sorry," Blake gasped, each word emerging as a wheeze because of the pressure on his throat. "I didn't know. I'm sorry. Please, I didn't mean for any of this to—" "That's the problem, Blake," Serena interrupted, and she leaned down so her face was just inches from his, so close that he could see his own reflection in her eyes. And what he saw there was a pathetic creature who deserved everything that was about to happen to him. "You shouldn't need to know who I am to treat me like a human being. You shouldn't need to know that I'm an FBI agent or that I have power or authority or connections that can hurt you before you decide to treat me with basic dignity and respect, because every person you encounter deserves that, regardless of what they look like or how much money they have or whether they can fight back against your abuse." The door to the cell burst open and 3 FBI agents in full tactical gear appeared with rifles raised and flashlights mounted on their weapons, cutting through the dim interior of the cell, and the lead agent assessed the situation in approximately 1 second. Serena Voss on top of a suspect who was pinned to the ground and disarmed, no immediate threat to agent safety, and he lowered his weapon fractionally and said into his radio, "Clear agent secure. Suspect down and disarmed." Serena looked up at her tactical team and allowed herself a small smile that was the first genuine expression of satisfaction she'd felt since Blake had pulled her over on Highway 9 approximately 6 hours earlier, and she said with dry humor that cut through the tension, "Nice of you guys to drop by. I was just in the middle of teaching Officer Blake Thornton here about the consequences of profiling and abuse of authority. But since you're here now, you can take over the educational portion of his experience." Blake was sobbing openly now, great heaving sobs that shook his entire body and made him look even more pathetic than Serena would have thought possible, and he kept repeating the same words over and over like a broken record. "I didn't know. I'm sorry. I didn't know who you were. Please, I'm sorry. I didn't know." Serena climbed off Blake and allowed the tactical team to secure him with flex cuffs that they pulled tight enough to make him wince, and as they hauled him to his feet and began reading him his rights in voices that were professional and detached and completely unsympathetic to his tears, Serena stood and brushed the dust from her clothes and took a deep breath. That was the first truly relaxed breath she'd taken since this nightmare began. She looked down at Blake one more time, this man who had tried to destroy her life and failed so spectacularly that he'd instead destroyed his own, and she spoke to him with a finality that made it clear this was the last time she would waste words on someone so beneath her notice. "You know what the real tragedy is, Blake? It's not that you're going to prison. You deserve that. And worse for what you've done, not just to me, but to countless other people who didn't have the resources or the authority to fight back against your abuse. The real tragedy is that there are hundreds or maybe thousands of other cops just like you in departments across this country. Cops who think the badge gives them permission to hurt people. Cops who've never faced consequences because the system protects them, instead of the people they're supposed to serve. And you're going to become an example, a warning, a cautionary tale that maybe will make some of those other cops think twice before they decide to abuse their power. Serena turned away from Blake and walked out of the cell without looking back. And the last thing Blake saw before they dragged him into the hallway was her straight spine and confident stride, the bearing of someone who'd won not just this battle, but the entire war, someone who'd been tested and had passed that test with her integrity and her dignity intact, even after being subjected to treatment that would have broken lesser people. The Pine Ridge Police Department had been transformed in the space of less than 30 minutes from a functioning law enforcement agency into what looked like a crime scene being processed by an occupying army with FBI agents moving through every room and hallway with methodical precision, photographing everything, seizing evidence, and rounding up every officer who'd been on duty during the shift when Serena had been arrested. Chief Graham Wheeler was already in federal custody, sitting in the back of an FBI transport vehicle, with his hands cuffed behind him and his head hanging low in a posture that suggested complete defeat, and he kept muttering to himself about lawyers and immunity deals and how none of this was his fault, how he'd just been trying to protect his department and his officers from a situation that Blake had created without his knowledge or approval, which was a lie so transparent that even Wheeler didn't seem to believe it as he spoke the words. Sergeant Dalton was dragged out of the locker room where he'd been trying, unsuccessfully, to hide inside a storage closet that smelled of old uniforms and cleaning supplies, and the agents who found him weren't gentle as they yanked him to his feet and spun him around to apply handcuffs, because they'd seen the body camera footage from the traffic stop, and they knew that Dalton had been complicit in Blake's actions, even if he hadn't actively participated in the assault, had known or should have known that something was wrong, but had chosen to back his fellow officer instead of questioning whether the arrest was legitimate. Deputy Vance came out voluntarily with his hands already raised and tears streaming down his face, and he kept saying over and over that he didn't know that Blake had told him Serena was high on drugs and combative, and needed to be secured, that he'd just been following orders from a superior officer and didn't realize they were kidnapping a federal agent. The clean sweep extended beyond just the officers who'd been directly involved in Serena's arrest, because Special Agent in Charge Dominic Kane had made the decision that this wasn't just about punishing the individuals who'd committed crimes today, but about dismantling an entire culture of corruption that had allowed those crimes to happen in the first place, that had created an environment where officers felt comfortable planting evidence and lying on reports and abusing civilians because they'd been taught through experience that the department would protect them from consequences no matter what they did. Every officer on duty was being detained for questioning. Every computer in the building was being seized for forensic analysis. Every file cabinet was being emptied and its contents cataloged, and the message being sent was clear. The FBI wasn't here to make arrests and leave. They were here to tear this department apart piece by piece until they understood exactly how deep the corruption ran and who was responsible for allowing it to flourish. Outside the station, news helicopters were already circling overhead, competing for airspace with the FBI's helicopter, and reporters were setting up cameras behind the perimeter that federal agents had established to keep civilians and media at a safe distance. And within the hour, this would be the lead story on every local news channel and would start trending on social media as cell phone videos taken by residents who'd heard the commotion spread across the internet with hashtags demanding accountability and justice. A trucker who'd been passing through Pine Ridge earlier in the day came forward with dash cam footage that showed Blake's initial traffic stop, showed him approaching Serena's vehicle with his hand on his weapon and his body language screaming aggression and intimidation, showed him yanking her from the car and throwing her against the hood with more force than could possibly be justified by the situation. And that footage would go viral within hours and become the visceral emotional core of a story that was about to capture the nation's attention. Blake Thornton was loaded into a transport van with movements that were rougher than strictly necessary, and the agents handling him weren't being deliberately brutal, but they also weren't being particularly gentle either, because Serena Voss was one of their own and Blake had attacked her and tried to destroy her, and in doing so had declared himself an enemy not just of one agent but of the entire bureau. Blake sat in the back of the van with his wrists shackled to a D-ring in the floor, and he was still wearing his uniform, but it no longer felt like armor or authority or anything except a costume. A cheap polyester joke that marked him as someone who'd been pretending to be a protector when he was actually a predator. Hours ago, he'd been Officer Blake Thornton, a man with a pension and a girlfriend and a truck and a reputation and a future that seemed secure and predictable and built on the foundation of the badge he wore on his chest. And now he was inmate number pending assignment, a defendant awaiting trial. A man whose life had been reduced to whatever could fit in an evidence bag, and whose future consisted of nothing but court dates and prison sentences, and the long, slow years of paying for decisions he'd made in moments of panic and arrogance and casual cruelty that he'd convinced himself didn't matter, because the people he hurt didn't matter. Opposite Blake in the transport van sat Special Agent Martinez, a burly man with a thick beard and eyes that looked like they'd seen the bottom of the ocean and come back with knowledge that had changed him in fundamental ways. And Martinez didn't speak or offer commentary or engage in any kind of conversation, because there was nothing to say. Nothing that would make this situation anything other than what it was, a corrupt cop being brought to justice by the very system he'd tried to subvert and manipulate for his own benefit. Martinez just watched Blake sweat and tremble and occasionally sob, and he felt something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite contempt, but was somewhere in between, a recognition that Blake was both a villain who deserved punishment and a cautionary tale about what happened when you gave flawed people power and didn't hold them accountable for how they used it. Blake kept thinking about the bag of cocaine he'd planted in Serena's car, kept replaying in his mind the moment when he'd pushed it into the cavity under the carpet and convinced himself that this would solve his problems instead of creating new ones. And he wondered now, with the clarity that comes from having your delusions stripped away, whether anyone would actually believe his version of events, whether any jury would look at the evidence and conclude that Serena Voss was a dirty agent, instead of recognizing that Blake Thornton was a dirty cop who'd gotten caught and was trying desperately to lie his way out of consequences. His fingerprints were on the bag. His body was on the surveillance footage, his lies were recorded on multiple cameras and audio devices, and the truth was so obvious and so thoroughly documented that there was literally no defense strategy that could overcome it. "Don't hurt yourself thinking too hard," Martinez said suddenly, his voice rumbling like gravel being poured from a truck. "We know about the impound lot. We know about the cocaine you planted and the carpet you cut and every single move you made from the moment you pulled Agent Voss over until right now. And there's no story you can tell that will make any of that go away or sound like anything other than what it actually is." Blake's head snapped up and his eyes went wide with a panic that was almost comical in its intensity. I was just doing an inventory search that's standard procedure when we impound a vehicle. I was following department policy. Save it for the tape." Martinez interrupted, and his tone was bored rather than angry, because he'd heard every excuse and every justification that criminals could invent, and none of them were original or interesting anymore, save all your lies and your explanations for when you're sitting across from a federal prosecutor who's going to offer you exactly one chance to cooperate before they bury you under so many charges that you'll die in prison still owing years on your sentence. The processing center at the FBI field office in New Orleans was clean and sterile and terrifyingly efficient in ways that made the chaotic booking room at Pine Ridge look like a medieval dungeon by comparison, and Blake was marched through intake procedures that were designed to strip away every last vestige of his identity and authority and transform him from a person with a name and a history into a number in a system that processed defendants with the same dispassionate efficiency that a factory might use to process raw materials into finished products. Unlike the filthy, overcrowded cells where Blake had thrown countless suspects over the years, unlike the deliberately uncomfortable conditions that Pine Ridge maintained to punish people before they'd even been convicted of crimes. The federal facility was clean and professional, and completely unconcerned with making anyone suffer beyond the baseline suffering that came from being incarcerated and awaiting trial. Face the wall a processing agent ordered, and his voice carried no malice or satisfaction or emotional content whatsoever, just the flat effect of someone performing a job they'd done thousands of times before. "I'm a police officer," Blake whispered, and the words sounded pathetic even to his own ears, sounded like a plea rather than a statement of fact. "Professional courtesy, I thought maybe." The agent laughed. And it wasn't a cruel laugh or a mocking laugh, but rather a genuinely amused laugh at the absurdity of Blake's request. "You lost any claim to professional courtesy when you kidnapped one of ours. Now spread your feet and put your hands on the wall before I have to make you do it." Blake was patted down thoroughly and professionally. And then came the moment that broke something fundamental in his psyche, the moment when the last pretense of who he thought he was got stripped away and left him standing naked in front of strangers. Strip the processing agent commanded, and there was no room for negotiation or debate in that single word. What Blake stammered, his hands clutching at his uniform shirt, like it was the last thing tethering him to his former identity. "Strip means take off all your clothes," the agent explained with exaggerated patience, like he was talking to a small child who didn't understand simple instructions. Standard procedure for all incoming detainees. "We need to check for contraband injuries, identifying marks, and we need that uniform for evidence, since you were wearing it when you committed multiple federal felonies. So take it off now, or we'll cut it off and you'll be naked either way." Blake stood shivering in the air-conditioned room as he unbuttoned the uniform shirt that he'd ironed so carefully that morning when the world still made sense, as he took off the pants with the sharp creases that he'd been so proud of, as he removed every piece of clothing until he stood completely exposed and vulnerable in a way that made him understand for the first time what he'd done to all the people he'd humiliated during traffic stops and arrests, what it felt like to be stripped of dignity and autonomy, and the basic right to keep your body private from strangers who didn't care about your comfort or your shame. He was handed an orange jumpsuit that was scratchy and ill-fitting and smelled of industrial detergent mixed with the sweat of all the previous people who'd worn it. And as Blake pulled the jumpsuit on and zipped it up, he caught sight of himself in the reflective surface of a metal panel on the wall. And the person staring back at him was unrecognizable, not Officer Blake Thornton, with his platinum blonde hair styled just right, and his muscles carefully cultivated, and his uniform pressed to perfection, but inmate awaiting processing a criminal in Prison Orange, a man who'd thrown away everything that mattered for reasons he could no longer even articulate clearly. While Blake was being processed in New Orleans back on Highway 9, where this entire disaster had begun, Special Agent in Charge Dominic Kane was crouching down beside a silver minivan talking to an 8-year-old boy named Jordan, who sat in the back seat with his hands folded in his lap and his expression serious in the way that children look when they're trying very hard to be brave and helpful, even though they're scared and confused by everything happening around them. Jordan's mother, Lisa, had flagged down the first FBI agent she'd seen once the cavalry arrived at the Pine Ridge Police Department, and she'd shown them the video she'd recorded on her phone, and that footage was now being uploaded to the FBI's evidence servers, where it would join the mountain of documentation proving exactly what Blake Thornton had done and exactly how little justification he'd had for doing it. "Hi, Jordan," Kane said, and his voice was gentle in a way that suggested he had children of his own and understood how to talk to them without being condescending or frightening. "I'm Agent Kane, and I work with the lady who was being stopped by that police officer. Can you tell me what you saw today?" Jordan nodded seriously and said with the kind of clarity that made Kane's heart ache. Because children shouldn't have to witness things like this, shouldn't have to learn at age 8 that the people who were supposed to protect them sometimes hurt people instead. The policeman was being mean to that lady, even though she wasn't fighting back or doing anything wrong. She was just standing there with her hands on the car and he kept pushing her and touching her in ways that looked like they hurt. And I asked my mom why he was being so mean because you told me that police help people, and Mom said we should record it so there would be proof of what really happened." "That was very smart of your mom," Kane said, and he reached over to squeeze Lisa's hand where it rested on her son's shoulder. "And you're a very good witness, Jordan. Do you know what a witness is? Someone who tells the truth about what they saw." Jordan recited, and the definition was clearly something his parents had taught him recently, had explained to him as they'd waited for the FBI to arrive and take their statements. Even if telling the truth is hard or scary or makes people angry, you tell it anyway because truth is more important than being comfortable. Kane felt something tighten in his chest, felt tears threatening at the corners of his eyes, even though he was a tough veteran agent who'd seen horrors that would break most people because this child understood something that Blake Thornton had never learned, had internalized a lesson about integrity and honesty that some adults went their entire lives without grasping. "That's exactly right," Kane confirmed, "and we're going to need you to be a witness at a trial, which means you'll have to tell a judge and a jury exactly what you saw today. Do you think you can do that?" Jordan looked up at his father, Anthony, seeking permission or reassurance, and Anthony nodded and said with pride evident in his voice, "You can do it, buddy. Just tell them the truth the same way you told Agent Kane, and that's all anyone can ask of you." "Will it help the nice lady?" Jordan asked, and the question went straight to the heart of why he was willing to do this scary thing. Why he was willing to stand up in a courtroom and talk about something that had frightened him. Will telling the truth make sure she's okay and the policeman can't hurt anyone else? Kane wanted to hug this child, wanted to tell him that the world needed more people like him. People who saw injustice and wanted to fix it instead of looking away and pretending it wasn't their problem. But instead, he just nodded and said with absolute certainty, "Yes, Jordan. Your testimony is going to help that nice lady very much, and it's also going to help make sure that police officer never hurts anyone else ever again. Because when people like you tell the truth, it makes it impossible for bad people to hide what they've done." "Then I'll do it," Jordan said simply because my teacher says we should always help people who need it, and that lady needed help even if nobody else was helping her. Lisa was crying openly now. Tears of pride and heartbreak mixed together, and she pulled her son into a hug and whispered against the top of his head, "I'm so proud of you, baby. You're braver than you know." 3 hours after being extracted from Cell 6 at the Pine Ridge Police Department, Serena Voss sat in a conference room at the FBI's New Orleans field office, giving her official statement to the internal affairs investigators who would be reviewing this entire incident to determine what went wrong and how to prevent it from happening again. And she was exhausted in a way that went beyond mere physical tiredness and extended into that bone-deep weariness that comes from having your faith in humanity tested and finding it wanting. The conference room door burst open without warning, and Serena's training had her hand moving toward her weapon before her conscious mind could process what was happening. But then she saw Kiana's face, and everything else disappeared except the overwhelming relief and joy of seeing her daughter safe and whole and running toward her with arms outstretched. "Mommy!" Kiana screamed, and the word was half sob and half laugh, and she crashed into Serena with enough force that they both almost toppled over. "Backward," they said, "you got hurt. They said bad police officers tried to arrest you. They said, 'Shh, baby, I'm okay,'" Serena whispered, wrapping her arms around her daughter and holding on tighter than she probably should have been holding on, like Kiana was the only solid thing in a world that had spent the past 8 hours trying to prove that nothing was stable or certain or guaranteed. "I'm right here. I'm safe. Everything's going to be okay now." Over Kiana's head, Serena made eye contact with her mother Gloria, who stood in the doorway looking like she'd aged a decade in the hours since she'd gotten the call that Serena had missed her check-in and was being listed as potentially in danger. And Serena mouthed the words, "Thank you," because she knew that Gloria had been the one keeping Kiana calm and distracted and protected from the worst of the worry while Serena was locked in that cell, unable to communicate with anyone outside the Pine Ridge Police Department. Kiana pulled back just far enough to look up at her mother's face, and her hands came up to touch Serena's cheeks, as if to verify that she was really there and really okay, and she asked with the devastating directness that only children possess, "Mommy, why did those police hurt you?" "I thought police were supposed to be good guys." Serena took a deep breath and made a decision to tell her daughter the truth instead of some sanitized version that would protect her from uncomfortable realities, because Kiana was 9 years old and growing up in a world where she needed to understand that the badge didn't automatically make someone trustworthy or good. That power could corrupt even people who started out with good intentions, that the system was imperfect and required constant vigilance and accountability to function the way it was supposed to. "Remember what we talked about this morning?" Serena asked, smoothing Kiana's hair back from her forehead with gentle fingers, about how sometimes people with badges forget that the badge is supposed to protect everyone, not just give them power to hurt people they don't like. Kiana nodded solemnly, her eyes never leaving her mother's face. "Well, today I met some police officers who forgot that lesson very badly," Serena continued, "and they treated me like I was a criminal instead of like I was another law enforcement officer trying to do the right thing. And they did that because they looked at my skin color and my old car and my worn-out clothes, and they decided I didn't deserve respect or dignity or basic human decency, and baby, that was wrong. What they did was not just a mistake, it was a crime, and now they're going to face consequences for their choices, just like anyone else would." "Did it work?" Kiana asked, and Serena was confused for a moment until her daughter clarified. "Did you remind them? Did you teach them that the badge is for protecting people?" Serena smiled despite the tears that were now streaming down her own face. Smiled because her daughter was asking exactly the right question, was focused on the mission rather than on the personal injury that had been inflicted, was thinking about making the world better, rather than about revenge or punishment. "Yes, baby, it worked." Serena assured her they learned that lesson very thoroughly today, and they're going to spend a lot of years thinking about it and hopefully becoming better people because of what happened. "Good," Kiana said with satisfaction, and then she wrapped her arms around Serena again and added in a whisper that was clearly meant just for her mother's ears, "You're my hero, Mommy, not because you caught the bad guys, but because you didn't let them make you scared or mean or give up on making things better." Special Agent in Charge. Kane knocked gently on the conference room door and stuck his head inside, and he said with genuine apology in his voice, "Sorry to interrupt the reunion, but Agent Voss, there's someone else here who wants to meet you. Someone who helped make sure we had the evidence we needed to hold these officers accountable." Jordan entered the conference room holding his father Anthony's hand, and he looked even smaller and more vulnerable in this sterile government building than he had sitting in the back seat of his family's minivan, but his expression was determined and serious in a way that suggested he understood the importance of what he'd done. Serena stood up from where she'd been kneeling to hug Kiana, and she looked down at this 8-year-old boy who'd witnessed her humiliation and had chosen to bear witness instead of looking away, and she felt a surge of gratitude so powerful that it made her throat tight. "You must be Jordan, Serena," said, and she crouched down again so she was at his eye level instead of looming over him the way adults so often did with children. "Agent Kane tells me that you were very brave today, that you told the truth even when it was scary to do." Jordan nodded shyly and looked at his father for reassurance before asking in a small voice, "Are you okay now? You look scared when that policeman was being mean to you. And I wanted to help, but Dad said we had to wait for the right time." "I am okay now," Serena confirmed, and she reached out to shake Jordan's hand with the solemnity of one professional acknowledging another. "And you did help. You helped more than you probably realize, because the video your mom recorded is going to make sure that police officer can never hurt anyone else. The way he hurt me, and your testimony about what you saw is going to help a jury understand exactly what happened and why it was wrong." Kiana stepped forward with the kind of boldness that came from being raised by a mother who taught her to be fearless and kind in equal measure, and she said to Jordan, "Hi, I'm Kiana. That's my mom you helped, and I think you're really brave, because lots of people see bad things happen and they don't do anything about it, but you did something and that makes you a hero just like her." Jordan's face lit up with a smile that transformed his serious expression into something bright and hopeful, and he said with the enthusiasm of a child making a new friend, "Want to be friends? We could trade phone numbers and maybe play games online sometimes." The two children started chatting about video games and school and all the normal things that children care about, and the adults watching them felt their hearts breaking and healing at the same time breaking, because these kids had to witness and be part of something so ugly and unjust. Healing because despite everything they'd seen and experienced, they were still capable of connection and joy, and the kind of innocent optimism that suggested the world might actually get better if enough people cared enough to make it so. The federal courthouse in Baton Rouge was packed beyond capacity on the morning that United States versus. Blake Thomas Thornton finally went to trial with spectators lining up hours before the doors opened to secure seats in the gallery and reporters from every major news network jockeying for position outside the building, where they would provide live coverage of what had become a national story about police accountability and the consequences of abusing power. Blake sat at the defense table wearing an ill-fitting suit that his public defender had secured from somewhere, and he looked diminished, somehow smaller than he'd seemed in his uniform, as if the process of being arrested and processed and held in pre-trial detention had physically shrunk him, or revealed that his previous imposing presence had been nothing more than costume and attitude rather than anything real or substantial. The prosecution was led by Assistant United States Attorney Victoria Reeves, a black woman in her 50s who'd spent 3 decades watching cases like this get buried or dismissed or settled quietly without any real accountability, who'd seen too many officers walk away from obvious crimes with nothing more than administrative punishments or early retirements with full pensions, and her voice when she addressed the jury during opening statements carried the weight of all those years of frustration and determination channeled into this one case that would either prove the system could work or confirm that it was irreparably broken. The trial lasted 5 days, and the prosecution's case was overwhelming in its thoroughness and its attention to detail, playing the body camera audio that captured Blake's racist comments and his lies about smelling marijuana, presenting the drone footage in crystal-clear 4K resolution that showed Blake planting the cocaine with such obvious deliberation that several jurors visibly gasped when they saw it calling witness after witness who testified about Blake's pattern of excessive force and discriminatory stops and casual cruelty toward people he'd decided deserved to be punished. Dispatcher Natasha took the stand with tears streaming down her face, and she testified under oath that Blake's claim about smelling marijuana was a running joke in the Pine Ridge Police Department, a code phrase that officers used when they wanted to search someone's vehicle without having actual probable cause, and her testimony was devastating because it came from someone who'd been part of the system and had enabled its corruption for years, but had finally decided that protecting Blake Thornton wasn't worth destroying her own soul. Forensic experts confirmed that the cocaine Blake had planted in Serena's car had been stolen from the Pine Ridge Police Department's own evidence locker, had been checked out 3 months earlier during a case that was mysteriously dropped before it went to trial, and the chain of custody paperwork showing Chief Wheeler's signature on the requisition form made it clear that this wasn't just Blake acting alone, but was part of a larger pattern of evidence manipulation and corruption. Then, Lisa Chen took the stand and played the video she'd recorded from her minivan, and the jury watched in complete silence as Blake threw Serena against the hood of her car and conducted a pat-down that looked more like assault than legitimate police procedure watched as he mocked her and dismissed her attempts to identify herself. watched as he dragged her away in handcuffs while she maintained her composure and dignity even as he tried systematically to destroy both. And finally transmitted via video link because of his age, Jordan testified with a clarity and simplicity that cut through all the legal complexity and got to the heart of what had happened. The policeman was being mean when he didn't have to be, Jordan said, looking directly into the camera with those serious 8-year-old eyes. The lady wasn't fighting or running away or doing anything dangerous, but he hurt her anyway. And when I asked my mom why, she said it was because some people forget that being powerful means you're supposed to protect people who are weaker, not hurt them. The jury box was silent except for the sound of one juror crying quietly into a tissue, and when Jordan finished his testimony, the judge had to call a brief recess because half the people in the courtroom needed a moment to compose themselves after hearing a child describe injustice with such devastating accuracy. Serena Voss took the stand on the 4th day of trial, and she looked directly at Blake as she spoke, and he couldn't meet her gaze, couldn't face the judgment he saw there. In my years with the Bureau, I have worked with cartels and organized crime families and domestic terrorists, Serena testified, but I have never encountered a criminal who hid behind a badge with such arrogance and such casual cruelty. Blake Thornton didn't just break the law. He believed he was the law, that his authority was absolute and his actions were beyond question. And when he realized his mistake, when he understood that he'd arrested a federal agent who had the power to hold him accountable, he didn't apologize or try to make things right. He decided to send me to prison for 20 years just so he could avoid a reprimand on his personnel file. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours, and when they returned, the foreman read the verdict with hands that shook from the emotional weight of what they'd witnessed. We, the jury, find the defendant, Blake Thomas Thornton, guilty on all counts. Guilty of kidnapping a federal officer, guilty of civil rights violations, guilty of conspiracy to distribute narcotics, guilty of obstruction of justice, guilty of tampering with evidence, guilty of assault under color of authority. Blake closed his eyes as the word guilty was repeated again and again, each repetition feeling like a physical blow, and a single tear escaped and ran down his cheek. But he made no sound, just sat there absorbing the verdict that would define the rest of his life. Judge Ramona Sterling was an African-American woman in her 60s who'd grown up in the segregated South and had spent her entire career fighting against the kind of injustice that Blake Thornton represented. And when she looked down at him from the bench, her expression was one of withering contempt, mixed with something that might have been sadness for what he could have been if he'd made different choices. "Mr. Thornton," Judge Sterling said, and her voice filled the courtroom with an authority that made everyone sit up straighter. "You have disgraced the uniform you wore and betrayed the public trust that was placed in you when you were given a badge and the authority that comes with it. You utilized the power of the state to terrorize the very people you were sworn to protect, and you did so not out of any legitimate law enforcement purpose, but out of arrogance and prejudice, and a fundamental belief that some people matter less than others, and therefore deserve to be treated as less than human." She paused and let the silence build, let Blake sit there squirming under the weight of her judgment. And then she continued. "There is no greater crime in a civilized society than tyranny disguised as justice, no greater betrayal than a guardian who becomes a predator, no greater corruption than power used not to protect the weak, but to victimize them and you, Mr. Thornton, are guilty of all of these things and more." The gavel came down with the finality of a coffin lid being nailed shut. "I sentence you to 22 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for the first 15 years. And I recommend that you spend every single day of that sentence thinking about the choices you made and the lives you damaged, and the trust you destroyed because the badge you wore gave you the power to change lives for the better, and instead, you chose to use that power to inflict pain and suffering on people whose only crime was looking different from you, or having less money, or being in the wrong place when you decided you wanted to feel powerful." United States Marshals hauled Blake from his chair with rough efficiency, and as they led him toward the door that would take him to the prisoner transport vehicles, Blake looked back one final time, and his eyes found Serena sitting in the front row behind the prosecutor's table. He mouthed the words, "I'm sorry," one more time, hoping for what he didn't know. Forgiveness maybe, or acknowledgement, or some sign that she understood he wasn't entirely the monster she'd made him out to be. But Serena didn't blink, didn't smile, didn't give him anything except a look that said he wasn't worth her anger anymore, that he'd become nothing more than a cautionary tale, a warning to other officers about what happened when you confused authority with immunity. "Goodbye," inmate Serena whispered, and though Blake couldn't hear the words from across the courtroom, he could read them on her lips, and they followed him out the door and into the transport van, and would echo in his head for the next 22 years. As Blake was led away, the camera panned across the courtroom, showing Kiana holding Serena's hand and squeezing it with pride, showing Jordan with his parents in the gallery doing a small fist pump of victory, showing Gloria wiping proud tears from her eyes. And in an adjacent courtroom that very same afternoon, Chief Graham Wheeler received his own sentence of 18 years in federal prison after pleading guilty in exchange for testimony against other corrupt officials in the parish and the dominoes that Blake had set in motion, with one arrogant traffic stop continued to fall, dismantling an entire network of corruption that had operated for decades under the assumption that nobody was watching and nobody would ever care enough to hold them accountable. 3 years later, the relentless Texas sun beat down on the exercise yard at Beaumont Federal Correctional Complex, turning the concrete into a griddle that burned through the thin soles of prison-issued shoes, and Blake Thornton pushed a broom across scorching pavement with movements that had become automatic through endless repetition. His platinum blonde buzz cut now shaved down to nothing because hair was a privilege. You lost when you entered the system. His once carefully cultivated muscles withered to something gaunt and hollow, because the gym equipment here wasn't for sculpting an image, but for survival, for maintaining just enough strength to protect yourself from the predators who roamed these yards looking for weakness. He wasn't Officer Thornton anymore, wasn't anyone's idea of authority or power or control. He was Inmate 47821, or as the general population called him with vicious accuracy, the pig, and every single day as he swept the same concrete under the same brutal sun while guards watched from towers with rifles ready to fire, he remembered what it had felt like to hold that power himself, to be the one with the weapon and the authority and the ability to make people suffer. And the irony wasn't lost on him, even though understanding it didn't make it hurt any less. Thousands of miles away in Washington, D.C., where monuments to justice and democracy rose from marble and limestone like prayers carved in stone. Special Agent Serena M. Voss walked into her new office on the 5th floor of the J. Edgar Hoover Building, and the plaque on her door read, Deputy Assistant Director, Civil Rights Division, in letters that represented not just a promotion, but a vindication. Proof that doing the right thing, even when it was hard, could lead somewhere other than punishment, and her view overlooked the Capitol dome where laws were made and debated and sometimes actually enforced when enough people cared enough to demand it. Her phone buzzed with a text from Kiana, who was now 12 and already talking about following her mother into law enforcement, and the message contained a photo of a perfect report card with all A's and a caption that read, Future FBI agent like Mom. And Serena smiled not with triumph or satisfaction, but with the quiet clarity that comes from understanding that Blake Thornton's 22-year sentence wasn't the real victory. The real victory was that her daughter could grow up believing that justice was possible, that the system could work, that badges could be worn by people who deserved them and used to protect rather than oppress. The Pine Ridge Police Department no longer existed, as an entity had been completely disbanded and rebuilt from the ground up as the Pine Ridge Community Safety Department, with civilian oversight boards and mandatory de-escalation training and body cameras that couldn't be turned off or angled away. And in the lobby of the new building hung a photograph of 9-year-old Jordan Chen, shaking hands with Deputy Assistant Director Serena Voss, beneath a plaque that read, "Justice isn't about power over others. It's about protecting those who have no power to protect themselves." And next to that photograph was a second plaque listing the names of 17 officers who'd been arrested, tried, and convicted in the investigation that had started with one corrupt traffic stop and had metastasized into the largest police corruption case in Louisiana history, a reminder that accountability was possible when people were brave enough to demand it and persistent enough to see it through. And somewhere in a Texas prison where the temperature never dropped below sweltering and the walls closed in a little more every day, a heavy steel door slammed shut with the finality of consequences, delivered locking Blake Thornton in the darkness he had built for himself, brick by brick, through choices made in moments when he thought nobody was watching, and nobody would ever care while thousands of miles away. Serena Voss opened a new case file regarding corruption allegations in a Miami police unit and whispered to her empty office with determination that had only grown stronger through everything she'd endured. Let's go to work. If this story of justice and accountability moved you, please like and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing these important stories. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from, and share your thoughts about how one person's courage can change an entire system. And remember, the badge is never a crown. Power is always a responsibility, and eventually, inevitably, everyone faces consequences for the choices they make. See you in the next story.